Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. I will now begin story 1. Heating the castle from the ground up. You stand in a great hall that smells of smoke and damp wool. The wind whips at the thick stone walls, and the only source of heat glows dully in a large fireplace half the size of a wagon. The fire crackles, but you notice something peculiar. Your feet are still cold, your knees numb, and the drafts seem to snake beneath the doorways like silent, invisible animals. Welcome to the medieval castle, not the grand, roaring fortresses of fantasy novels, but the real, chilly, drafty world of stone and silence. And perhaps nothing tells the true story of a castle better than what's under your feet. Cold stone, often slightly wet, always unforgiving. Before torches flickered against walls and lords strode through their halls, a different problem had to be solved. How do you survive when heat escapes from everywhere, especially the floor? The problem of stone. Stone was the material of power, durable, impenetrable, fireproof, but it was also a terrible insulator. Castles, especially those built after the Norman conquests of the 11th century, relied heavily on limestone, sandstone, and granite, abundant, heavy, and cold. Once the ground froze in winter, the stone floors inside would hold that cold like a secret. Wooden floors existed in earlier timber halls, but the shift to stone brought a dilemma. These floors didn't just fail to keep the heat in, they actively absorbed it, drawing warmth away from bodies, clothing, and fire. You could put rugs down, and some did, but these were rare, expensive, and often used sparingly. A single woven carpet might be worth more than a servant's yearly wage. Rushes, straw, and herbs were more common. Scattered across the floor, these natural materials served not just as rudimentary insulation, but as waste-absorbing layers. They absorbed the smoke, the grease, and even the bodily waste of the inhabitants. Rushes might be changed once a season, if that. And so the cold from the stone wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. It reminded people of their place, grounded, low, and subject to the whims of wind and season. The birth of hypocausts, and why they didn't last long. Curiously, heating from the ground had once been mastered by the Romans. The hypocaust system, a Roman invention, involved raising floors slightly and channeling hot air from wood-fired furnaces through the space beneath. This warmed both floors and walls. Some of these systems survived into the early Middle Ages, especially in bathhouses and high-status villas. In places like Roman Britain, remnants of hypocausts lingered well into the early medieval period. Monastic sites occasionally retained these clever systems, though more for their bathing rituals than domestic comfort. But by the 10th and 11th centuries, such systems were rare, labor-intensive, requiring constant fuel and maintenance, and dependent on advanced masonry. Hypocausts faded into obscurity in favor of simpler, more immediate heating systems. In castles, where defense mattered more than comfort, practicality won over engineering sophistication. Fires moved upward into hearths. The cold stayed beneath. The fireplaces and the problem they couldn't solve. One might assume a large fireplace would be enough, but it rarely was. Early medieval castles often lacked proper chimneys. Smoke was expected to rise and escape through louvered openings or holes in the roof. This meant that warmth was often sacrificed to remove smoke. You'd cough, your eyes would water, but your feet would still be cold. Fireplaces were typically built along the outer walls of rooms, sometimes tall enough to walk into. The heat they provided was intensely localized. Anyone more than a few feet away would find little comfort. And since heat rises, only the higher levels of a room benefited. Tapestries helped, to be sure, acting as crude insulation on stone walls. But the floors, the stone remained cold. This was especially punishing at night. The Great Hall at night. Imagine the Great Hall emptied of feasting, the fire reduced to embers. Servants wrap themselves in cloaks and lean against each other for warmth. Some sleep on benches, others on the rush-covered floor. There are no floorboards to buffer the cold, only straw, a cloak, and your own breath. Nobles, of course, retreated to chambers, but even there, the luxury was modest. Beds were raised off the floor in part to escape the worst of the chill. Wooden frames, feather mattresses, and heavy woolen blankets created islands of warmth in a sea of cold. Bed curtains were not just decorative, they were survival tools, trapping breath and heat close to the body. And beneath the bed, a chamber pot and a floor so cold it could sting your bare feet. Lower chambers and the unheated spaces. The lower levels of castles' basements, kitchens, storage rooms were the coldest of all. In some castles, entire storage areas were built below ground, where the temperature remained relatively stable throughout the year. While this was good for food preservation, it meant that anyone working down there in winter suffered greatly. Even servants who worked near fires like cooks had to deal with the contrast between burning heat and icy air. In kitchens with large cauldrons and open flames, the face might sweat while the feet remained numb. Fires rarely reached into corners. Heat was not ambient, it was a matter of proximity. Feet first, medieval solutions. How did people cope? Wool was king. Not just one layer, but several. People wore thick woolen hose, often wrapped in additional cloth bindings. Leather shoes, while fashionable for the wealthy, were often no match for frozen stone. Some wrapped their feet in cloth, fur, or even straw. In extreme cases, servants heated stones in the fire and placed them at the foot of the bed, or even carried them in small clay pots to warm specific areas of the room. In monasteries, where silence and discipline prevailed, monks would often walk barefoot on cold stone as an act of penance. But even these austere souls eventually adopted sandals, wool socks, or foot wraps to endure long winters. And in some castles, straw mats or planks were added in winter months, not elegant but functional. A symbol of wealth and power. Oddly, the solution to cold floors often revealed the structure of power itself. The wealthiest lords could afford wooden subfloors, imported rugs, and wall hangings. Their private chambers were better sealed, better appointed, and less affected by the raw bite of winter. Meanwhile, servants and grooms slept where they could, in stables, near the hearth, or on rushes laid across cold stone. Over time, the installation of wooden floors became a marker of rising affluence. In castles with larger keeps and tower houses, flooring techniques improved slowly. But even by the 14th century, stone floors were common. They were simply covered with more layers of rugs, hay, or suffering. And so the cold remained. As the fire dwindles and night deepens, you might pull a woolen cloak tighter, curl your feet beneath your body, and watch your breath mist in the air. For all the power the castle represents, for all the stone and steel, it could not fully conquer the cold. This tension, the need for defense versus the desire for warmth, shaped much of daily life. Castles weren't built for comfort. They were built to last. But it leaves one wondering. If the cold floor was so central, why didn't medieval builders return to Roman innovations like the hypocaust on a larger scale? You left the last section with a lingering question. Why didn't medieval builders return to Roman methods like the hypocaust to solve the problem of cold stone floors? It seems like such an obvious solution. The Romans had developed it, used it extensively, and left behind ruins as evidence. And yet, centuries later, cold stone floors continued to dominate the architecture of power across Europe. The answer, as with most things in history, isn't simple. It's not about knowledge being lost, it's about priorities, resources, labor, and the peculiar inertia of tradition. The misconception of the Dark Ages. Let's first put aside one popular myth, that people in the medieval period didn't know about hypocaust systems. They did. In monastic libraries, Roman texts described the principles. Ruins dotted the countryside, especially in Britain, France, and parts of Germany. Some noble families even built castles atop or near old Roman villas, where remnants of underground heating systems could be found. The knowledge wasn't gone, but the willingness or ability to replicate it was diminished. Building a hypocaust required skilled masons, architects, and a vast supply of fuel. It also required a different mindset, a long-term investment in comfort rather than short-term utility. For most medieval lords, especially in the turbulent centuries following the fall of Rome, this was impractical. Why build an underfloor heating system when your castle might be under siege next winter? Fuel, the persistent limitation. The Romans had built their hypocausts in cities and villa complexes, often surrounded by abundant forests and supported by slave labor. Their system worked because it had a near-endless supply of fuel and manpower. Medieval castles, especially from the 11th to 13th centuries, didn't have that luxury. Wood was valuable, and forests were often carefully managed under feudal law. The lord of the castle had rights to woodland, but vast deforestation over time led to scarcity. Heating a hypocaust required an almost industrial-scale use of firewood. It wasn't just about warming a single room, it meant heating an entire floor, day after day, through winter. Most castle lords preferred to concentrate that heat in specific areas: great halls, kitchens, and occasionally chapels. Everything else, that could remain cold. The economic cost of firewood alone made hypocausts unappealing, even if the engineering knowledge survived. And this economic limitation reveals something deeper about medieval priorities. Survival, not comfort, defined their architecture. Flues and chimneys, a slow innovation. While underfloor heating was largely abandoned, other technologies began to creep into castles in a piecemeal fashion. Chief among them, the chimney. It might surprise you to learn that chimneys, as we think of them today, didn't become common until the 12th or even 13th century. Before that, smoke was allowed to drift upward, escaping through roof vents or holes in the ceiling if it escaped at all. Great halls would be filled with smoke. Servants, grooms, cooks, and guards spent years coughing, wheezing, and living in a fog of wood smoke. When chimneys were first introduced, they were architectural curiosities. Expensive, difficult to build, and initially prone to malfunction, they caught on slowly. But once they did, they revolutionized heat distribution. Chimneys allowed for smaller, more private fireplaces. Now, upper rooms could have their own hearths. Not central ones, but corner fireplaces with narrow flues, tucked into walls. This decentralization of heating meant that heat could be better targeted, even if it still did little for the cold beneath your feet. Eventually, by the 14th century, multi-flue chimneys allowed a single chimney stack to serve multiple rooms. This changed castle life. The shift from communal great hall living to more private, compartmentalized rooms was tied closely to the rise of the chimney. Yet again, the cold floor remained. The heating hierarchy, who got the warmth? In any castle, who got to be warm was a matter of hierarchy. At the top, the lord and lady had access to heated chambers, bed curtains, and thick furs. Their rooms were closest to the kitchen and the chapel, two areas where fires burned steadily. Their beds were not only high off the floor but sometimes outfitted with bed wagons, movable wooden frames that contained hot coals underneath, kept in ceramic pots. These would be placed under the bed at night and removed in the morning. The household steward, chaplain, and favored guests also enjoyed fireplaces, though perhaps smaller. Their rooms might have access to rugs or wall hangings. Servants, guards, cooks, they lived in cold rooms, often communal, sometimes windowless. They might sleep close to the animals in the stables or in unheated attics above the hall. Their warmth came from each other, from movement, and from wool. Even among the working class, warmth was a social currency. Some castles employed warming rooms or calefactories, a term borrowed from monasteries. These rooms, centrally located, featured a constant fire and served as a refuge for the coldest days. But they were rare. For most people, the solution was simple: endure. Hearthstones, braziers, and portable heat. Not all heat had to come from built-in hearths. As the centuries wore on, portable heat sources became more common. Braziers, small portable metal containers used to hold burning coals, could be carried from room to room. While dangerous and prone to accidents, they offered localized warmth, especially in rooms without fireplaces. A brazier placed under a table with a thick cloth draped over it created a small pocket of warm air. The Japanese concept of a kotatsu, a heated table, didn't exist in medieval Europe, but in practice, nobles used similar techniques. Some households developed custom furniture with heated compartments. However, this was limited to the wealthy. Foot warmers, small wooden or ceramic boxes filled with coals, were also used, especially by women and elderly members of the household. These were carried during travel and used during long meetings or prayers. These innovations were useful, but they all had one problem: they were temporary. None could compete with the enduring cold of stone floors in winter. The slow rise of wooden subfloors. By the 14th and 15th centuries, another change crept in: the gradual shift to wooden subfloors in certain rooms. Instead of walking directly on the stone slab foundation, builders began installing wooden platforms a few inches above the stone. These insulated floors trapped a small layer of air underneath, which reduced the transfer of cold. Rugs became more common, imported from the East or woven locally, especially in merchant households. In the most advanced castles, such as those in Burgundy, Bavaria, or the Loire Valley, some floors even had underfloor voids with limited heating, though still far from Roman hypocausts. The point here is that change was slow. It took centuries for the cold floor to be acknowledged as a problem, and even longer for it to be addressed architecturally. Knowledge forgotten or willfully ignored. So now we return to the original question: why didn't medieval castles adopt Roman heating systems? The truth seems to lie in a mix of constraints. Cost and labor. Heating a floor was far more complex than lighting a fire. Fuel limitations. Castles prioritized cooking, lighting, and survival over comfort. Defensive architecture. Solid stone mattered more than warm floors. Tradition and inertia. If it was good enough for your father, it was good enough for you. And perhaps there was a deeper cultural attitude at play. Cold was seen as natural, even virtuous. Warmth was fleeting, indulgent. To suffer the cold, especially if you were poor or pious, was not a problem to solve but a condition to endure. Even the nobility wrapped themselves in discomfort, as if it were part of the fabric of honor. One can't help but wonder, if survival meant enduring the cold, how much innovation was lost not to ignorance but to the slow acceptance of suffering. The previous section ended with a question worth pausing on. How much innovation was lost not to ignorance but to the slow acceptance of suffering? To understand the deeper implications of cold stone floors, we have to step beyond the mechanics of heating and into the culture, psychology, and symbolism of warmth in medieval castle life. This final section will explore how warmth became a class signifier, how religion framed physical hardship as moral strength, and how enduring the cold shaped not just comfort but character, status, and even spirituality. Because, in the end, the stone beneath your feet wasn't just cold, it was part of the social order. The rituals of cold. Living with cold wasn't merely an inconvenience, it was ritualized, scheduled, expected. In castles across Europe, daily life was built around managing temperature. Servants would rise early not just to begin the day's chores, but to relight fires that had burned low overnight. Firewood had to be rationed. Coals had to be banked and protected to preserve their heat until the next morning. You would have known, instinctively, where the warmer corners were, just as you would know who was allowed to sit there. In a great hall, proximity to the hearth was a reflection of your social standing. Lords sat close. Guests of honor sat to the right or left. lesser folk further out. The outer edges of the hall were cold and dark, sometimes quite literally out of earshot of the Lord's conversation. Clothing, too, followed the same logic. Wealthy households layered wool upon wool, added linen undergarments, fur-trimmed sleeves, and thick cloaks fastened with expensive brooches. The poor might have one outer garment and one inner. Warmth came with status. The cold reminded you of your place. Even eating habits reflected heat access. Hot meals required fuel and fire. Those with wealth had hearth-cooked stews, warmed meats, or heated wine. The rest might eat cold bread and cheese, or pottage prepared once and eaten for days. In such a world, warmth wasn't a universal right, it was a mark of belonging. The holy cold, religion and the virtue of endurance. One of the reasons cold endured in the medieval world is because it was seen not only as natural but sometimes holy. In monasteries and convents, suffering was a virtue. Mortification of the flesh was a form of spiritual discipline. Enduring physical hardship, including cold, was a way to draw closer to God. Monks in Northern Europe, especially those of the Benedictine order, observed long periods of silence, fasting, and exposure to the elements. Their dormitories were unheated, their cloisters open to the wind. They bathed rarely. The chill was a form of purification. Some accounts speak of monks rising in the middle of the night around 2 or 3 a.m. to sing prayers in freezing chapels, dressed only in simple robes. These weren't acts of masochism, they were declarations of faith. This attitude filtered into lay society as well. Cold was not always viewed as a problem to be solved, but a reminder of your human frailty. Warmth, by contrast, could be seen as indulgent. A comfortable bed, a heated room, these were not inherently noble things. They were potentially softening, dangerous even. And so, for many, the cold became woven into the very idea of moral order. The ability to endure it became a kind of spiritual badge. The castle as an idea, not just a home. The persistence of cold in castle life also had architectural implications tied to power and permanence. The castle was a symbol. It had to be strong, immovable, eternal. The thick stone walls were not only defensive, they were ideological. They represented order in a chaotic world, a bulwark against the wilderness. But they came with costs. Drafts were constant. Windows were small, limiting light and airflow. Rooms were tall and often cavernous, making them hard to heat. Fireplaces radiated warmth only in one direction. Even in an age when kings and queens could summon craftsmen from across Europe, the idea of radically reshaping the internal temperature of a castle, of making it truly warm throughout, was rarely pursued. Why? Because the discomfort was part of the aesthetic. It's easy to imagine that had medieval lords demanded total thermal comfort, innovation would have followed. But castles were not designed around comfort. They were designed around symbolism. They were meant to be impressive, not cozy. And so the stone remained. Gender and warmth, the lady of the chamber. Interestingly, within the cold reality of castle life, women often played a key role in managing warmth, especially in noble households. The lady of the castle was often responsible for the domestic domain, including the comfort of private rooms. Her chamber would have its own fireplace, bed curtains, layered rugs, and possibly fur-lined wall hangings. In the evening, she might supervise the warming of the bed, often by heating stones wrapped in cloth or by placing pots of embers under wooden frames. She might also oversee the washing of woolens, the airing out of bedding, and the storage of seasonal garments. In this way, the management of warmth became part of the domestic power structure. The ability to make a room warm, to control fire and fabric, was tied to her role, her dignity, and her perceived competence. And yet, even she lived in a world of relative cold. Accounts from the 14th and 15th centuries describe noblewomen writing letters with stiff fingers, or hosting guests while cloaked in layers, seated near the fire, hands extended to the heat. A castle might be filled with servants, gold, and fine goods, but still remain cold at its core. The Frozen Edge, castle life in the far north. To better understand the limits of medieval heating, it's helpful to look northward towards Scotland, Scandinavia, and the Baltic. In these regions, castles contended with snow, ice, and months of biting cold. Here, some minor innovations began to emerge. In parts of Sweden and Norway, for example, builders began using turf and wood in conjunction with stone. Turf-roofed halls were better insulated. In Scotland, tower houses often used double-wall construction with narrow inner chambers that could be more easily heated. Chimneys spread faster here than in southern Europe, simply because the need was greater. Even so, the solutions were partial. Wood remained scarce. Fires consumed vast resources, and for most people noble or common winter remained a time of bodily conservation, huddled living, and constant cold. The slow shift toward comfort. It wasn't until the Renaissance and early modern period, 15th-17th centuries, that real changes took hold. Better chimney design, improved insulation techniques, glass windows, and the increasing popularity of smaller, compartmentalized rooms began to transform interiors. Castles evolved into manor houses. Power moved from the battlements to the study. The symbolism of stone gave way to the comfort of plaster and timber. Fireplaces became decorative as well as functional. Portable stoves gained popularity. Wool was refined, dyed, and made into more sophisticated garments. But the transition was slow, glacial, even. For nearly 500 years, castles remained partially warmed symbols of power. Cold beneath your feet was part of the deal. A legacy of stone. Today, when you walk through a medieval castle real or reconstructed, you may feel an eerie stillness. But what you also feel, if you're there in winter, is the cold. It seeps into your bones, echoes off the stone, and wraps around the silence like a second skin. This is the same cold they knew, the same floor, the same firewood problem, the same question: how do you survive a winter in a place built not for warmth but for endurance? They answered it not with technology, not at first, but with hierarchy, habit, and humility. And perhaps the stone beneath their feet wasn't just a material. It was a message that life was hard, power was cold, and survival, like fire, had to be carefully managed every single day. Story 2. Wool, lice, and layers, the clothing that fought the chill. Imagine it's late November. The frost has settled on the hedgerows. The castle walls no longer drip from autumn rains but hold their chill like ancient tombstones. And inside, beneath stone vaults and drafty beams, people go about their lives, wrapped in wool, weighed down with fabric layered like onions. It is here, not in the glittering armor of knights or the flowing robes of kings, that you find the real survival story of medieval fashion. Because warmth wasn't only a matter of fire, it was woven. The ubiquity of wool. Wool was to medieval Europe what plastic is to us today. Everywhere, essential and often overlooked. Sheep provided the raw material not just for clothing, but for blankets, wall hangings, cloaks, and even insulating mattress stuffing. By the 12th century, wool had become one of the economic backbones of the English and Flemish regions, in particular an entire industry resting on the backs of countless sheep and the toil of thousands of hands. From the fields to the spindle, the journey of a single woolen garment was long and laborious. Sheep had to be shorn, their wool washed, combed, carded, spun, and woven. All of this was done by hand. It was a communal effort, often carried out in homes and outbuildings, involving children, mothers, and aging grandmothers. In winter, the spinning wheel became a symbol of domestic endurance. Once woven, wool took on many forms. There was coarse bureau worn by peasants and friars, itchy but dense. There was finer broadcloth, exported to the continent and worn by merchants. Nobles wore worsted or dyed wool, sometimes blended with linen for softness. But rich or poor, everyone wore wool. It was simply a matter of how much, how fine, and how layered. Layers as lifelines. The concept of dressing in layers is not modern. Medieval people mastered it out of necessity. The base layer for men and women alike was usually a linen undergarment, called a chemise for women or shirt for men. Linen, not wool, went against the skin. It was cooler in summer, and it absorbed sweat in winter. Linen was expensive and labor-intensive to produce, but essential. It helped protect the outer wool garments from becoming too soiled too quickly. Over this came the wool, multiple layers of it. For men, hose or braised trousers, often in separate legs tied to the waist. A tunic or cot, sometimes reaching to the knees. A surcoat or overtunic, heavier, thicker, sometimes lined with fur. A cloak or mantle, pinned with a brooch at the shoulder. For women, a linen shift, then a long kirtle, a fitted woolen gown. Over this, a surcoat or sleeveless overdress. In colder months, a gown with long sleeves and additional wool cloaks. Hoods, mittens, scarves, and even coifs, close-fitting caps, helped retain warmth. Children were often swaddled like bundles and carried under layers of fabric. The layering system was practical. It allowed wearers to add or shed garments as needed. Wool retained heat even when damp, and in the absence of central heating, your clothing was your most reliable insulation. Still, not all wool was created equal. Wool as a marker of status. The quality of your wool said much about who you were. The poor wore undyed, coarse wool brown, gray, or dull off-white, depending on the sheep's natural color. These garments were rarely tailored. They were cut large to accommodate all body types and passed down through generations. The wealthy, by contrast, could afford dyed wool colors like madder red, woad blue, or green made from weld and fustic. These colors faded quickly but offered a moment of brightness in otherwise gray seasons. Deep blues and purples were particularly expensive and signified both wealth and spiritual importance. Even the texture and weave of wool varied. A well-to-do merchant might wear a fulled wool garment shrunk and brushed to a tight nap, making it warmer and water-resistant. A noblewoman's gown might be lined with squirrel fur, vair, or trimmed with ermine, adding both warmth and symbolism. The clothes you wore not only protected you, they declared your place in the world, and the cold made that distinction all the more vivid. The lice within the layers. But warmth came at a cost. Heavy wool clothing, rarely washed and worn constantly, became a breeding ground for vermin. Lice, fleas, and even ticks thrived in the seams and folds of medieval garments. Linen underclothes were washed regularly, but wool was not. Washing wool risked shrinking it, warping it, or ruining the lanolin oils that made it somewhat water-resistant. Instead, woolen clothes were brushed, aired, and sometimes beaten with sticks to remove dust and lice. Combs were essential tools not only for hair but for clothes. Personal hygiene was not absent in medieval life, but it was shaped by different assumptions. Soap was available but harsh. Hair was washed infrequently. Instead, people maintained cleanliness through layers of linen, periodic laundering, and the occasional steam bath if you were fortunate enough to live near a bathhouse or monastery. Still, during the colder months when layers stayed on longer and bathing declined, lice were an accepted reality. They had names, superstitions, and treatments, but rarely shame. They were, like the cold, part of life. The power of the cloak. Perhaps the most symbolic piece of cold weather clothing was the cloak. It served as outerwear, blanket, and bedding. A well-made cloak could last a lifetime. Circular or semicircular in design, it was often fastened at the shoulder with a pin or brooch. Some were hooded, others draped dramatically, used for both show and shelter. Travelers especially relied on cloaks. A knight on the road might wear armor, yes, but also a heavy woolen cloak to protect against frostbite. Monks walked in cloaks that swept the ground. Women used them to wrap children, cover baskets, or kneel upon in churches. The cloak was often the last defense against the cold and the most visible sign of wealth or piety. In illuminated manuscripts, saints and nobles alike are portrayed in swirling cloaks. To give your cloak to another, especially to the poor, was a well-known gesture of charity. Saint Martin of Tours famously cut his cloak in two to share with a beggar, a story that lingered in the medieval imagination. But when the cold came, there was no sharing. You wrapped yourself tightly, tucked your hands inside, and kept walking. Work, warmth, and movement. One truth about medieval life that often surprises modern readers: people moved, constantly. Not for leisure, but for heat. If you were not noble, you worked. You hauled wood, mended fences, carried water, tended fires. Even in castles, servants climbed stairs, ran errands, fanned embers, served food. Movement generated warmth. And for the poor, especially in unheated homes, work was often the only thing keeping them warm. Children were bundled but sent out early. They helped gather kindling or watched animals. Elderly family members stayed near the hearth if one existed. Others wrapped their legs in woolen strips or sat on stools covered with straw. Warmth was earned through effort. Rest stillness was dangerous. Sitting too long meant losing heat. It meant noticing the ache in your bones, the sting in your fingers. So people moved, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. In wool we survived. By now it becomes clear that medieval clothing wasn't about fashion. It was about survival. Layer by layer, people built their defenses against the cold using the only material widely available, renewable, and reliable: wool. It covered the newborn and the dying. It filled closets, chests, and coffers. It formed the basis of international trade and local identity. Wool was power, wealth, heat, and humility, and every thread of it had to be worked by hand, dyed by skill, and fitted by craft. Still, one can't help but wonder, if wool was so central, how did the medieval economy respond when a single winter threatened the flocks? In the previous section, we explored the role of wool in daily medieval survival, how layers of it wrapped every man, woman, and child through long, dark winters. But beneath those garments was an invisible story, one of markets, flocks, trade routes, and labor. Because wool was more than warmth, it was wealth. When a winter struck hard and flocks died, it wasn't just a farmer's misfortune. It was an economic tremor that could ripple from a remote field in Wales to a merchant stall in Bruges. This section unravels the intricate web of fleece and fortune that clothed the Middle Ages. Wool as economic engine. By the High Middle Ages, c. 1100–1300, wool had become the beating heart of the European economy. Especially in England, the wool trade rivaled and eventually eclipsed nearly every other form of income. Monarchs taxed it, lords counted it, monasteries raised it. Sheep were not merely livestock, they were currency. The most famous phrase from the period, often half-jokingly cited by scholars, is that England was built on the back of a sheep. This wasn't far from the truth. In fact, the English crown grew so dependent on wool exports that customs duties on wool became a key part of royal income. One common tax was known as the wool sack, levy literally based on the number of sacks of raw wool exported abroad. And where was it going? Mostly to Flanders. Flanders, the loom of Europe. In modern terms, Flanders, what is now parts of Belgium and northern France, was the textile powerhouse of medieval Europe. Towns like Ghent, Ypres, and Bruges became legendary for their weaving guilds and cloth markets. But these bustling cities had one significant limitation: they lacked sufficient local wool. Enter England. English wool, especially from the Cotswolds, Lincolnshire, and parts of Wales, was highly prized. It was long-fibered, soft, and ideal for weaving into fine cloth. Flemish weavers depended on its regular arrival, and English landowners depended on Flemish money. This created a strange interdependence. The English peasant might never see Flanders, and the Flemish weaver might never shear a sheep, but their fates were tied across the North Sea. When flocks were wiped out by disease or frost, prices soared. And during war, the wool trade became a weapon. Monarchs would restrict exports, triggering economic distress in rival territories. Warmth had become a matter of politics. The rise of the wool towns. Back in England, entire communities rose on wool. Towns like Lavenham, Shrewsbury, and Stamford owed their wealth to wool production. Lavenham, in particular, grew wealthy enough in the 15th century to build elaborate guild halls and a stone church that dwarfed its population. These were not royal towns. They weren't capitals. They were sheep towns, centers of shearing, dyeing, and trading. Their guilds regulated who could sell, how much, and at what price. If you were a skilled weaver or a merchant with access to a strong supply of fleece, you could become wealthy, sometimes wealthier than lesser nobility. But with that wealth came vulnerability. A single harsh winter, like the legendary freeze of 1315–1317, could decimate flocks. The resulting famine wasn't just from crop failure, but from the economic vacuum created when sheep died in droves. No fleece meant no cloth. No cloth meant no trade. And trade meant life. The monasteries and their flocks. It wasn't only private landowners who saw the value in wool. Monasteries, those bastions of religious devotion, became major players in the wool economy. Cistercian abbeys in particular excelled in sheep farming. Remote, self-sufficient, and economically savvy, they acquired vast tracts of land and managed massive flocks. Monks might live in poverty, but their abbots negotiated directly with merchants and tax officials. Fountains Abbey in Yorkshire, for instance, ran thousands of sheep and exported fleece across Europe. They maintained wool houses for drying, shearing barns, and even their own ports on navigable rivers. One could walk through a cloister and hear the chanting of psalms while, just beyond the wall, lay thousands of grazing animals, all part of a complex spiritual and economic system. Ironically, the very wool that warmed a nun's cloak or a novice's robe was often sold off, with the proceeds used to fund cathedral repairs, manuscript copying, or hospital construction. Wool and war. With so much value in wool, it's unsurprising that it became entangled with war. During the 100 Years' War, 1337–1453, wool exports became a diplomatic tool. England used access to wool as leverage, offering it to allies, withholding it from enemies. Flemish cities that sided with France found their looms idle when English wool shipments were cut off. Conversely, when Ghent and Bruges supported English claims, the wool flowed. Kings literally wore the economy on their backs. The Lord Chancellor of England still sits on a wool sack, a physical reminder of the medieval period, when fleece was the foundation of the realm. Even within England, the wool trade could stir conflict. Peasant revolts sometimes centered on grain and bread, but when taxes on wool were raised, entire regions rebelled. Warmth, when too costly, became a cause for blood. Fleece fraud in the black market. Where there is wealth, there is corruption, and wool was no exception. Smuggling became rampant. Merchants would underreport the weight of their wool sacks to avoid taxes. Others tried to export wool without licenses or sold inferior blends falsely labeled as English. In response, monarchs introduced wool inspectors, who would stamp bales and penalize dishonest traders. Some weavers in Flanders even developed ways to stretch a single fleece into a larger bolt of cloth, watering down the quality, but increasing the volume. Naturally, this led to complaints, trade disputes, and the occasional embargo. The medieval wool trade, for all its pastoral imagery, was a cutthroat business. Those cloaks worn in noble courts, they might have passed through 6 hands, 2 countries, and 3 sets of forged documents before arriving on a lord's back. The social cost of warmth. For all its economic might, wool had social consequences. In some villages, the push for more grazing land led to enclosure, a process by which common lands were fenced off by landlords to make space for sheep. This displaced peasant families who had once relied on shared pastures for survival. The phrase "sheep ate men," famously used by Thomas More in the 16th century, had its roots in the late medieval shift toward wool-based wealth. Lords realized they could profit more from sheep than from people. Wool was predictable. It didn't complain. It didn't rebel. So peasant cottages were torn down, fields converted, and families turned out, all in pursuit of more fleece. The warm garments worn by lords were lined with the cold consequences faced by the poor. The global threads begin. By the 15th century, the European wool economy began to shift. Italian merchants began importing fine wools from Spain. Silk, cotton, and even exotic textiles from the East entered the markets, but wool remained dominant, woven into tapestries, tunics, and trade deals. And the legacy of that wool still visible. Place names, town halls, tax records, and even coats of arms bear sheep, spindles, or looms. In modern England, the town of Romsey still hosts the annual Wool and Water Festival. In Flanders, wool museums recount the bustling days of the cloth halls. And in the UK's House of Lords, the woolsack remains a physical and symbolic link to centuries of fleece-fueled governance. Yet one wonders, for all the wool that crossed borders and lined coffers, what happened to those who spun, stitched, and sheared, and received no warmth from the wealth they helped create? You left the last section with a sobering question. What happened to those who spun, stitched, and sheared, and received no warmth from the wealth they helped create? To answer this, we must turn our gaze away from the halls of power and trade and look instead to the quieter corners of the medieval world. Cottages with low thatched roofs, windowless spinning rooms, and sheepfolds that smelled of wet fleece and old straw. This final section explores the human side of the wool industry, the people who lived with the cold not as a backdrop, but as a constant companion, and whose labor, invisible and repetitive, wrapped Europe in warmth. Shepherds, the winter guardians. At the start of every wool garment was the shepherd, a profession of quiet endurance. Unlike farmers who could rest somewhat during winter months, shepherds had no such luxury. Sheep required constant care, particularly during lambing season, which often came in late winter or early spring. In the cold months, shepherds slept outdoors or in makeshift shelters, wrapped in their own layers of coarse wool. Their clothing was rarely luxurious, often patched, mudded, and lined with sheepskin. They carried crooks, not just to guide their flock, but to clear snow, break ice, or lean upon during long, frozen vigils. In some areas, shepherds' huts, known in parts of England as bealdies or sheep cotes, offered slight relief from the wind. But for the most part, it was a solitary and frigid life. They were the first link in the chain, and often the most forgotten. Spinners, the women of the wool. If the shepherd started the process, the spinner sustained it. Spinning wool into thread was primarily a woman's task, and it was one of the most time-consuming domestic duties in medieval life. Before the spinning wheel spread widely in the 14th century, spinning was done using a drop spindle, a tool that relied on gravity, balance, and endless repetition. This meant that nearly every woman, from noble ladies to peasant girls, spent hours each day turning raw fleece into yarn. They spun while walking, watching children, or tending fires. In monasteries, nuns spun for their communities. In cottages, wives spun for their households and to pay rent or barter for food. The word spinster, once a job title, eventually became associated with unmarried women precisely because spinning was their occupation and social identity. In the winter months, spinning had added importance. Warm garments were not optional, they were life-preserving. Wool had to be processed indoors, often in cold, smoky rooms lit by rushlights. Spinners sat on stools, their fingers red and stiff from the cold, their eyes straining to see the fibers. It was not glamorous, it was not noticed, but it was essential. Carders, dyers, and weavers. Once spun, the wool passed through other hands. Each step involved its own winter realities. Carders used wire-bristled paddles to straighten the wool fibers. In colder months, the wool became more brittle and the work more difficult. Dyers had to keep vats warm and maintain exact temperatures, no small feat in unheated workshops. The process was labor-intensive, and the ingredients often toxic. Urine, alum, iron, and plant-based dyes all contributed to chemical reactions that fixed color into cloth. In winter, dyeing slowed and became harder to control. Weavers worked on large looms, often in unheated spaces. Their fingers had to remain dexterous enough to manipulate shuttles and threads, despite the cold air. The final product, a bolt of cloth, might take weeks or months to complete, depending on its quality and length. Most of these artisans were poorly paid, especially in rural areas. Guild regulations in cities protected some rights, but the countryside operated on barter, obligation, and survival. They too were wrapped in wool, but not necessarily in warmth. Children and cloth. In many homes, children joined the wool economy early. Young girls learned to spin from their mothers or older sisters by the age of 7. Boys helped tend sheep, clean tools, or beat dust from cloth. There were no child-sized spinning wheels or looms. They used what adults used, and they learned by doing. In winter, this meant cold fingers, poor lighting, and long hours. Some orphanages and monasteries used spinning as a form of discipline and training. Children there might spin or weave for hours each day, the results sold to fund the institution. Though these activities kept them indoors, they were rarely warm. Work was not a seasonal option, it was constant. Noble hands and symbolic labor. It's worth noting that wool also played a role in noble identity, albeit differently. Highborn ladies sometimes spun or embroidered, especially in religious contexts. Queen Matilda, wife of William the Conqueror, was famously credited with helping produce the Bayeux Tapestry, though the work was likely done by her ladies-in-waiting. Regardless, the image of noblewomen working with thread became a cultural ideal. Embroidery was seen as virtuous, delicate, and ladylike. But it wasn't warmth they made, it was symbolism. The difference between labor and leisure was stitched into every thread. The poor spun because they had to. The rich embroidered because they could. The final layer, clothing as a record of labor. Each woolen garment in the medieval world carried a hidden history, not of fashion designers or factories, but of individuals. A shepherd who kept his flock alive through a bitter frost. A spinner who spun through chilblains and darkness. A dyer who stoked a fire in a smoke-filled shed. A child who learned the spindle before she learned to write. They left no labels, no signatures, no recognition, but they left warmth. And so, when you imagine a medieval cloak, a thick, earth-colored mantle wrapped around a weary traveler, remember that it is not just a defense against cold. It is a garment made by dozens of unseen hands. It is months of labor, preserved in fabric. Legacy, the fabric of society. Today, the term cottage industry still echoes with this legacy. Before machines, before factories, warmth was handmade. Every stitch, every skein, every tunic represented hours of physical labor, often under the chill of winter. Modern wool garments are produced in minutes by machines, but for hundreds of years, each item was a small triumph over the cold, a human answer to the indifference of stone walls and long winters. The people who made these garments rarely owned much. They slept under the same cloth they spun. They wrapped their children in the same fabric they wove for lords, and they endured quietly, skillfully, persistently. And so we end this story not with a flourish, but a pause and acknowledgement of the hands that spun Europe's warmth, and a reflection. In an age where warmth was scarce and winter long, What kept people going wasn't fire or fleece alone, but the quiet certainty that someone, somewhere, was spinning. Story 3. Midnight Duties. The Night Servants of the Keep. It's well after midnight. The fire in the great hall has burned low. The stone corridors echo only the distant sounds of dripping water and the occasional creak of timber. A soft breeze hums through narrow window slits, carrying with it the deep cold of the night air. Most of the castle is asleep, tucked under wool blankets or huddled together in shared chambers. But not everyone. While lords and ladies sleep, while the kitchen cools and the chapel stands silent, a hidden class of workers stirs in the quiet, the night servants of the keep. These are not the famed knights or noble stewards you read about in chronicles. These are the overlooked, the watchmen, the chambermaids, the guardsmen on rotation, the kitchen hands tasked with tending the embers until dawn. They moved quietly, performed dull and repetitive tasks, and existed mostly outside the written record. But without them, the castle would freeze, fall into disorder, or worse, find itself vulnerable to fire, theft, or surprise attack. In this section, we step into their lives and ask, what was it like to serve a castle silently in the dead of night? The Night Watch, a cold and lonely vigil. Every castle, no matter how secure, had to be watched through the night. The threat of invasion, fire, or internal treachery was constant enough to require it. Thus, a rotating night watch was maintained, composed mostly of lower-ranking guards, yeomen, or even conscripted workers. These guards patrolled the walls, towers, and interior halls, checking doors, windows, and gates. They often moved in pairs, not for companionship, but to reduce the temptation of sleep. The gear of a night watchman was practical, not impressive. A warm woolen cloak, a lantern or candle box with a protective horn cover, and a short stave or cudgel for defense. In colder months, they might be issued an extra layer or allowed to huddle near brazier stations positioned at intervals on the wall walkways. Still, the cold was inescapable. One shift might last from sundown to midnight, the next from midnight to sunrise. These were the least desirable duties and often assigned to the least powerful. The goal was simple: stay awake, stay alert, stay quiet. The gatehouse keeper. Just beyond the outer walls, the gatehouse keeper held perhaps the most critical night role. Responsible for the drawbridge, portcullis, and front doors of the castle, this individual or small team ensured that no one entered or exited the grounds without permission. Gatehouses often had their own small hearth, which provided some relief during long winter nights, but sleep was forbidden. Any lapse could result in punishment or worse, a breach. Gatehouse records show that night logs were sometimes kept, noting any noises, visits, or odd sightings. Most are dull. Some hint at passing travelers begging for shelter or suspicious figures seen near the woods. Few incidents occurred on most nights, but that was the point. A good night was a boring night. Embers in the kitchen, the fire tender. Back in the castle's interior, someone had to tend the kitchen hearth. Fires were difficult to restart from cold, especially in winter, and a castle's kitchen might take hours to fully warm in the morning. So a fire tender, usually a junior kitchen servant or scullion, was tasked with keeping the embers alive through the night. This meant waking every hour or so, stoking coals, adjusting dampers, and sometimes preparing early morning broths for the sick or elderly. Fire tenders slept in or near the kitchen, wrapped in layers, occasionally curling up near the hearth to absorb what heat they could. Their job required no speed or strength, only diligence and wakefulness. Without them, breakfast would be delayed, bread wouldn't rise, the kitchen would stall. Chambermaids and knights on duty. In noble chambers, the hearth may have been warm, but that didn't mean the work stopped. Chambermaids sometimes remained on call during the night, especially in larger households. They might be summoned to fetch water, adjust bed curtains, or add logs to the lord or lady's fire. In some cases, they were required to remain awake in a side chamber, listening for a bell or knock. More unpleasant was night's duty, the collection and emptying of chamber pots. Human waste was stored in ceramic jugs or wooden containers during the night and disposed of at dawn. But in cases of illness, or among elderly or high-ranking individuals, this task might be done several times before sunrise. The term nightman also applied in towns, where such laborers hauled waste away in carts or buckets, often under cover of darkness. In castles, the task fell to the lowest-ranking servants, those whose names rarely made it into household rolls. Yet even this task had to be performed carefully. Sloshed waste on icy stairs or spilled near a hearth could become a safety hazard. Quiet precision was demanded. Tending the sick and the sacred. Castles often had a small infirmary or a designated sick room. Night nurses or carers tended to those who were injured, elderly, or ill. These roles were filled by women, often older and experienced in basic herbal remedies. The nurse's tools included wool-wrapped hot stones, herbal poultices kept near the fire, candles or rushlights, buckets of warm water replenished through the night. These women worked in semi-darkness, careful not to disturb sleepers, but always ready to respond to a cough, a cry, or a fever spike. In religious households, a chaplain or lay brother might also keep night vigil in the chapel. While less common in military castles, such religious observance persisted in many noble homes. Prayers for the dead, vigils before feast days, or quiet meditation filled the long hours of darkness. Here, warmth came not from fire, but from faith. The soundscape of the castle at night. Despite the stillness, a castle at night was not truly silent. You might hear the wind pushing through arrow slits or roof gaps, the distant clang of a gate hinge, the murmur of sleepers in shared halls, the scraping of wood on stone as a servant moved a stool, the slow drip of water from roof beams or wall joints, the occasional soft cough or snore echoing down a corridor. The servant walking these halls carried not just a lantern but a responsibility to notice every sound. Silence was its own warning. When a fire went out, when a watchman dozed off, when something broke in the dark. The cost of invisible work. These midnight duties were rarely recognized. If done well, they were unnoticed. If failed, they were punished. Servants who slept through shifts could lose their positions or face beatings. Fire tenders who let the hearth go out might be docked wages. Watchmen who fell asleep at their post could be imprisoned. The stakes were high, but the rewards were minimal. And yet these roles formed the invisible infrastructure of the keep. They kept the fires lit, the lords safe, the castle fed and cleaned and guarded. Without them, the great machinery of castle life would seize up before dawn. Anonymity by design. One curious feature of castle records is how rarely these night workers are named. You might read about a kitchen boy or housemaid, but almost never see their personal names. Their work was seen as routine, forgettable. Their presence was assumed, not praised. But in practice, they kept the castle alive, especially in winter, when cold and darkness amplified every need, every risk, and every vulnerability. They were the pulse beneath the stone. As the eastern sky begins to pale, the fire tender stokes the kitchen hearth for the morning cook. A watchman shrugs off his cloak, his breath fogging as he trudges toward the stairwell. The chambermaid pours water for her lady's morning wash, and the castle slowly begins to stir. But one wonders, what did these night workers think of the silence they lived within? Did they see themselves as essential or invisible? We ended the last section by asking, did the night workers of the medieval castle see themselves as essential or invisible? To answer this, we must examine more than just their tasks. We must consider their place within the machine of castle life. In this section, we dig deeper into the structure of labor, the social hierarchies that shaped nighttime duties, and the risks both human and environmental that came with working in the dark. Because midnight in the medieval world wasn't just a quiet time. It was a testing ground, a place where a servant's status, skill, and vigilance could mean the difference between a peaceful dawn and a deadly mistake. The staff pyramid, who worked at night and why? Not all servants were created equal. Castle households followed strict hierarchies, both during the day and after dark. Work was divided by role, rank, and perceived trustworthiness. At night, the castle's hierarchy didn't sleep, it merely shifted. At the top were the senior retainers, the steward, the marshal, the chamberlain. These men, often minor nobles themselves, rarely worked at night unless an emergency arose. Their job was to manage people, not embers. Beneath them were trusted servants, the head cook, senior maidservants, and guards with long-standing tenure. These individuals might sleep lightly, ready to be called upon. Some had designated rooms close to their areas of responsibility. Then came the junior staff, the pages, scullions, watchmen, and errand boys. They worked the night hours. They lit fires, cleaned tools, hauled water, or paced the battlements. Their labor was physically demanding, mentally dull, and often freezing. Why them? Because they were low enough in status to be ordered into discomfort, but essential enough to be entrusted with routine function. The very architecture of the castle reinforced this structure. Servants' quarters were often located in colder, lower, or peripheral parts of the building. To serve warmth, they had to live without it. Routine as survival. A castle at night was ruled by ritualized routine. Deviations from that routine were dangerous. The fire tender didn't just check the hearth when they felt like it, they followed a schedule, likely imposed by a superior. Guards walked their rounds in timed patterns. Water carriers filled jugs at certain hours. Chambermaids performed turn-down duties before a bell-marked nightfall. These routines created predictability, which was vital. A servant walking the halls at an unexpected hour might be mistaken for an intruder. A missing log on the fire might indicate not forgetfulness but illness or death. And the routines were layered. Before the household retired, doors were barred and bolted inwardly. Fires were banked, not extinguished, to preserve coals. Water jugs were filled in anticipation of frozen wells or pipes. Candles were snuffed, or ration night lighting was expensive. Prayer might be offered, especially on feast days or during hard winters. This was not a system of freedom, it was a system of vigilance. Dangers in the dark. Working at night in a castle was not merely uncomfortable, it could be deadly. Accidental fires were among the greatest threats. Candles knocked over, coals scattered by a draft, kitchens left untended. A single mistake could ignite wooden beams, tapestries, and straw rushes. For this reason, certain fires like those in sleeping quarters were sometimes watched until completely out, or, ironically, left smoldering and closely monitored all night. Structural hazards also posed risk. Many castles had uneven floors, steep stairs, and narrow walkways, especially in towers. At night, with minimal light, even a familiar route could become dangerous. A servant carrying a bucket of water or chamber pot had to balance carefully, avoid disturbing nobles, and stay silent. Exposure was another threat. Watchmen and outer guards sometimes succumbed to frostbite, illness, or sheer exhaustion. Guards falling asleep was not always laziness, it was often physical collapse. Some castles began issuing heated stones or coals in portable pots to outer posts, but only in the wealthiest households. And then there were human dangers, disgruntled staff, would-be intruders, even fellow servants prone to violence or theft. The dark magnified fear. One slip, one missed patrol, one forgotten lock, and disaster could unfold. Sleep as a privilege. While the nobility lay on feather-stuffed mattresses behind heavy curtains, most servants slept on pallets or benches, often in shared, unheated rooms. Night workers rarely got a full night's sleep. Their rest was broken 2 hours here, 1 hour there. Some castle households employed rotating shifts. One group might work dusk to midnight, another from midnight to dawn. But this was not always humane. The second group had to wake in the coldest, darkest hours and function in silence. Sleep became fragmented, exhaustion accumulated, and yet servants could not complain. Sleep was not a right, it was a luxury. There are scattered references in manorial rolls and complaint letters to servants slack in their watch or found asleep at post. These records rarely mention why. Hunger, cold, illness. These weren't excuses. In the eyes of the Lord, sleep lost meant danger prevented, but for the servant it was survival denied. Training in silence. New servants often learned through watching, not instruction. Night workers were paired with more experienced staff. A fire tender would teach a boy when to stir the embers, how to add logs without crackling, and when smoke signaled danger. A chambermaid might show her apprentice which floorboards creaked too loudly in the ladies' chamber. There was no manual, no written guide. Knowledge passed from hand to hand, whispered in the dark. The phrase "trained in silence" was more than a metaphor, it was a description. This training was essential. Clumsy servants made noise. Noisy servants were punished. Thus, competence in darkness became a mark of reliability. It was a strange kind of expertise, uncelebrated, unnoticed, and vital. Moments of stillness. Despite the labor, there were brief moments when the castle truly stilled. A servant between tasks might pause beside a quiet hearth and warm their hands. A watchman might stand on the tower and listen to the wind cross the moors. A chambermaid might press her forehead to a cold window and look out at the stars. These were fleeting pauses, never encouraged, but quietly taken. In such moments, the servant became a witness to time. They saw the castle in its most honest form, stripped of ceremony, of noise, of daytime hierarchy. Just stone, firelight, and breath in the air. Perhaps in those moments they did not feel invisible. Perhaps they felt something else, something close to ownership, if only for a heartbeat. The ever-turning wheel. When dawn approached, the rhythm changed. Fireplaces were stirred to life. Bread was started. Water was boiled. Floors were swept. Night workers passed tasks to day workers, if such a division even existed. The castle would begin to murmur and bustle. The silence would end. But the night would return again, and with it, the quiet rotation of duties. Because while the castle was built to defend, display, and dominate, it also had to function. And that function, especially during the coldest nights of the year, rested on the backs of those who lived without credit, without sleep, and often without thanks. They didn't shape history in dramatic ways, but they kept history's architecture warm, safe, and turning. Yet one wonders, for those who worked in the dark, rarely seen, what stories were told among them. What memories passed not in books, but in whispers shared beside glowing coals. In the silent hours between midnight and dawn, when the torches have burned low and the world seems made of stone and smoke, the keep lives through its servants. They are shadows on stairwells, breath in the cold air, fingers tending coals, and bare feet pressing into cold floors. But what of the stories they carried? In this final section, we reflect not just on the duties of the castle's night workers, but on their humanity, their small rebellions, their laughter in corners, the way they made meaning from labor, connection from silence, and life from long, cold nights. Because history often forgets them, but the stone walls remember. Stories without names. Most records from the medieval period mention night workers only in passing, if at all. The cooks and chambermaids, the fire tenders and guards, were considered part of the machinery of the household. They appear in account rolls, occasionally in coroners' inquests, or more rarely in court testimony when something went wrong. But otherwise they are ghosts. And yet these ghosts lived fully. They had nicknames, habits, rivalries. They joked and whispered and snuck small moments of rest where they could. They kept mental maps of warm spots in the castle, quiet stairwells where they could sit unnoticed, and floorboards that creaked too loudly. Some had been in service since childhood. Others arrived through hardship, widows who needed work, orphaned boys sent by a parish, or men injured in war who could no longer fight but could still hold a lantern. Their lives existed in margins between the kitchen and the hall, between sleep and wakefulness, between day and night. The culture of the night staff. Though silent, the night workers often formed their own micro-society bound not by status, but by routine, proximity, and shared hardship. There were rituals, a shared gulp of hot water passed in a wooden cup, the quiet nod exchanged at changing of the watch, the whispered blessing over the fire before banked embers were left for the night. There were also small rebellions, a bit of meat taken from the cooling kitchen, an extra log placed on a fire where only coals had been allowed, a short nap in the laundry room if no one was watching. Trust among these workers mattered. A sleeping guard endangered all. A forgetful fire tender could wake the cook's wrath, and a careless maid might ruin a noble mood for the entire day. So they watched each other, not in suspicion but in survival. The night demanded a quiet camaraderie. Footsteps and eavesdropping. Night servants often knew more than they should. They heard things. Whispers through the walls, footsteps in places where no one should be walking, raised voices behind locked doors, the quiet sobs of a servant scolded too harshly, the laughter of lords returning late from drink. In large households, gossip flowed upward from the night shift. A sharp chambermaid might know who was ill before the physician did. A boy tasked with hauling buckets might recognize the pattern of a secret visitor's steps. But silence was currency. Talking too much could mean punishment. The clever servant listened, remembered, and chose carefully when and if to speak. The breath of the castle. The cold wasn't only physical, it was existential. The loneliness of night work, especially during winter, could be overwhelming. Servants in towers heard only the wind. Those in corridors saw only shadow. The absence of conversation, of laughter, of light, it pressed inward. Some kept themselves sane by counting. Steps, breaths, logs, chiming hours. Others hummed under their breath. Some recited prayers. A few spoke aloud to the fire. And then there were the ghost stories. Nearly every castle had them. A lost maid who tumbled downstairs, a monk seen crossing the chapel after death, a knight who wandered battlements forever after falling in battle. These stories weren't always believed, but they were told quietly, at shift changes, beside banked fires, or over a shared crust of bread. They weren't just entertainment. They were a way to make sense of the hours when the world no longer seemed fully real. The risk of visibility. Though most night servants were invisible in daylight, there were moments when they became too visible, and that could be dangerous. A servant who made too much noise might wake a noble and face the sting of thrown words, or worse, thrown objects. A maid glimpsed in the wrong hallway might be accused of spying. A guard too familiar with a noblewoman could lose his position or his freedom. So night workers practiced intentional invisibility. Eyes lowered, voices hushed, footsteps soft. Their skill was not only in performing their duties, but in vanishing when those duties were done. Life outside the shift. Some of these workers had families. Some slept in barracks. Some lived just beyond the outer wall and walked home at sunrise with numb fingers and stiff knees. They paid for candles out of meager wages. They patched their wool garments themselves. They raised children who would take their place, and told stories about the castle's inner life that no noble ever heard. In winter, they often traded favors with one another. Extra water in exchange for kindling, a place closer to the fire in exchange for an hour's cover. They rarely complained because complaint was useless, but they observed, and they remembered. In that sense, they were the memory of the keep, its breath, its heartbeat, its nightly pulse. The fire goes on. As dawn spread light over the eastern hills, the final embers of the kitchen fire were stirred. The watchman handed off his post. The night nurse slipped into a narrow bed for 2 hours of sleep. The scullion cracked his knuckles and began hauling buckets for morning preparations. The keep came alive, but none of it would function if the night crew had failed. Without the embers, there would be no bread. Without the patrol, the gates might be open. Without the chambermaid, the Lord's hearth would be cold. Without the boy with the candle, the hallway would still be dark. And still they would not be thanked. But the fire would continue. Reflection. Castles are remembered for their walls, their moats, their banners. But between midnight and sunrise, none of those things mattered. Only the fire, the watch, the water, the silence. Those who served in the quiet hours did not shape kingdoms or lead armies. They were not praised in chronicles, but they held the castle together, thread by thread, breath by breath, step by step. Their labor may have been unseen, but it was never unneeded. Story 4. Candles, tallow, and smoke, lighting the medieval darkness. You stand in a castle corridor just after sunset. The sun has vanished behind the hills, and what little light filters through the narrow windows quickly fades to nothing. There are no switches to flip, no bulbs to glow to life, no hum of electricity, no comforting ambient light. Only the cold and the dark. This was the medieval world after dusk. To live in it meant to battle darkness every single day, not in great bursts of brilliance, but in small, smoky victories. A candle lit, a torch replaced, a wick trimmed. Illumination was not taken for granted. It was made slowly, laboriously, and at cost. This story begins not in a grand hall, but in the candle room, a space most castle inhabitants would never see, and yet whose products determined whether their evenings would be merely dim or utterly blind. The value of light. To the medieval mind, light was not merely a convenience. It was a precious resource as important to daily survival as bread or firewood. To waste it was foolish. To be without it was dangerous. Candles, torches, rushlights, and oil lamps were used sparingly, often rationed and carefully tended. A castle might have a dozen fires burning in hearths, but only a handful of rooms would be lit with candles at night. And only the most important rooms, the chapel, the Lord's chamber, perhaps the kitchen or the great hall on feast days. Most people lived by natural rhythms, waking at dawn, sleeping shortly after sunset. Those who worked after dark, servants, guards, scribes, did so under the faint glow of a flickering light source. Darkness wasn't simply tolerated, it was a default condition. The humble rushlight, the most basic form of medieval lighting, was not a candle, it was the rushlight. Made from dried rushes soaked in animal fat or grease, rushlights were inexpensive to produce and burned with a small, uneven flame. They sputtered, smoked, and gave off a weak glow, but they were accessible to peasants, servants, and poorer households. In castles, rushlights might be used in storerooms, servant quarters, or in passageways, places where true candles were deemed too costly to waste. Making a rushlight was a simple but time-consuming process. Gather marsh or river rushes in summer. Strip all but a thin layer of outer skin. Soak them in tallow rendered animal fat from cows, sheep, or pigs. Let them dry and harden. Each one burned for about 10 to 20 minutes. To stay lit for an hour, you needed several and someone to watch them. They filled the air with a greasy smell and left soot marks on walls. But in the dark, they were a gift. Tallow candles, the workhorse of the castle. The standard castle candle was made from tallow, rendered animal fat, usually from cows or sheep. Unlike beeswax, which was expensive and reserved for the church or nobility, tallow candles were more affordable and widely used in domestic settings. But affordable is relative. A tallow candle took time, labor, and material to produce. Fat had to be rendered, filtered, and stored. Wicks made from twisted linen or hemp had to be prepared. Molds or dipping vats had to be cleaned and maintained. Candles were formed either by repeatedly dipping the wick into hot fat or by pouring tallow into tin or clay molds. The result, a short burning, smoky candle with a distinct and unpleasant smell. They smoked heavily, dripped messily, and had to be trimmed frequently with a snuffer or wick scissor. Still, they were the backbone of nighttime lighting in castles. Tallow candle production was typically overseen by chandlers, either employed directly by the estate or visiting as part of traveling guilds. In larger households, candle making took place in autumn and early winter, when animal slaughter was at its peak. Candles were stored carefully in dry rooms, sometimes locked away like grain or wine. They were not burned lightly. Beeswax candles, reserved for the sacred and the elite. By contrast, beeswax candles were the luxury lighting of the medieval world. They burned clean, emitted little smoke, and filled rooms with a pleasant honey-like aroma. Their golden glow was steadier and brighter. But they were expensive. Beeswax had to be harvested from managed hives, filtered and stored. Monasteries and cathedrals often kept their own bees for this purpose, with monks or lay brothers trained in apiculture. The wax was used for altar candles, devotional lamps, and elite ceremonies. In castles, beeswax candles were largely reserved for chapel use, especially for feast days and vigils. Noble chambers, often one or two per night. Formal banquets, where lighting was part of the display of wealth. A noblewoman might receive a ration of 2 beeswax candles per night. A monk might light a single beeswax taper during matins. A guest might marvel at a hall lit by dozens of wax flames during a wedding feast, only to return to a rushlit chamber by bedtime. The church's reliance on beeswax also meant that local supply chains were often monopolized by religious institutions. For the commoner, or the average castle servant, beeswax was as distant as silk. Lamp oil and the challenge of supply. Oil lamps also existed, but they were less common in Northern Europe, where olive oil, the most reliable lamp fuel, was expensive and had to be imported from the Mediterranean. In castles, fish oil or animal fat might be used instead, but these burned poorly and gave off acrid fumes. Oil lamps required steady maintenance, wick trimming, cleaning soot, and constant refilling. They were more typical in merchant households, churches, or coastal towns with better access to imported goods. By and large, the castle's night was lit by tallow, rushlights, and firelight. Lighting the castle, a team effort. Providing light in a large castle wasn't a matter of striking a match and walking away. Lighting was a task assigned to specific individuals. A torchbearer led guests through dark corridors. A chamber servant lit the Lord's personal candle, then guarded it until extinguished. The porter kept a lantern in the gatehouse, sometimes shielded by horn panes. The chapel keeper lit votive candles in the early hours before Mass. In wealthier castles, chandeliers with tallow candles might be lowered on chains, lit, then hoisted aloft. In many cases, though, lighting was far more localized. A candle here, a rushlight there, a fire-banked hearth serving as both heat and visibility. Extinguishing candles was equally important. A forgotten rushlight could set straw rushes on fire, risking the entire castle. Thus, snuffers and extinguishers were common tools. Light was made and unmade with care. The glow and the smoke. Inside the keep, candlelight changed everything. It flattened shadows, brought faces into soft relief, and made even plain stone shimmer faintly. It was as much atmosphere as illumination. But it also brought smoke. Tallow smoke clung to walls, darkening tapestries and discoloring plaster. In winter, when windows stayed shut, the effect was worse. The air became heavy with soot and grease. Some castles employed smoke funnels, rudimentary hoods or chimneys that drew air upward, but these were uncommon in lower halls and servant quarters. Most simply endured. Servants who worked near candle flames often developed a kind of tallow fatigue, constant exposure to the smell and the sting of smoke in their eyes. Still, they learned to move within the light, how to hold a candle to avoid dripping, how to carry it low to reduce flicker, how to trim a wick to brighten or dim a room. It was a subtle, skilled practice, almost ceremonial. A flicker against the night. By midnight, most lights were extinguished. Only a few glowed: the hearth in the kitchen, a lantern at the gatehouse, a candle in the chapel. To walk the castle now was to walk in near total darkness, guided only by touch, memory, and the faint scent of burned tallow lingering in the air. In this world, light was not a default. It was a decision, and each candle flame was a minor triumph against the dark. But one can't help but wonder, how did those who worked in such darkness see the world around them? Did the limits of light shape not just their nights but their thoughts, their fears, and their sense of what could be known? The candle sputters in the iron sconce. The rushlight burns low in a corridor thick with cold air. The last torch in the courtyard has begun to smoke, its flame waning as the wind pulls at it. This is the world as most people knew it, not bright, not shadowy, but dark. In this section, we explore how this constrained light shaped the way medieval people worked, thought, worshipped, feared, and even dreamed. Because in a world with minimal artificial light, the flame did more than push back the dark, it defined what was possible inside it. Light meant time. In the medieval world, time was closely linked to light. The day began when the sun rose and ended when it set. Clock mechanisms were rare, unreliable, or unavailable to most. Instead, light itself was the clock. Morning tasks began at first light, a concept with no precise moment, only a gradual brightening. Meals were prepared according to the sun's position. In monasteries, prayers were divided by canonical hours, timed roughly by daylight. In the castle, major work paused at sunset, unless special light sources were arranged, and even then, that light came at a cost. The availability of candles or torches dictated how long you could work. For scribes copying manuscripts, candlelight was precious but eye-straining. For tailors or spinners, light determined the length of a productive day. For guards, it meant the difference between clear sight and blind guessing. The flame did not just offer light, it offered time. To have it meant extending the day. To lack it meant retreating into sleep, rest, or stillness. Light meant literacy. We often imagine the medieval scholar hunched over a scroll, illuminated by the flicker of a single candle. And this image is accurate but limited. Most people, especially the lower classes, could not read. But even among those who could, monks, scribes, clerks, access to light determined access to reading. Scrolls and codices were too valuable to be handled in total darkness. Monasteries assigned specific reading hours. Night vigils might allow some private devotional reading by candlelight, but these were exceptions. Scribes copying manuscripts at night had to work with great care. A dropped ink pot or a misread word in low light could ruin hours of labor. In wealthier noble households, private chapels and studies might be lit with beeswax candles, used not just for religious texts, but for personal reading. Yet even then, most reading happened in daylight. For the majority of people, words were heard, not read. And when they were read, they were often heard by candlelight in shared silence as a communal experience. Light meant control. Control of light was a symbol of authority. In the Lord's great hall, the right to keep a candle burning through the night was a mark of privilege. In servant quarters, candles were extinguished early. To be given a candle by a superior was to be granted permission to continue work, to stay awake, to move. The act of lighting was often ceremonial. A priest lighting altar candles for matins. a steward lighting the banquet chandeliers before a feast, a chamberlain lighting the Lord's personal taper before bed. Each of these moments reinforced the power structure of the castle. Conversely, the denial of light could be punishment. Servants sent to sleep without a candle faced pitch-black quarters. Prisoners were held in complete darkness. The difference between dim light and no light at all was more than functional, it was psychological. Light meant faith. The connection between light and the divine was profound. In religious life, candles weren't just tools, they were symbols of the soul. Monasteries and churches glowed with beeswax flames during Mass and vigils. The Paschal candle, lit at Easter, represented Christ's resurrection. Candles were placed near altars, statues, and tombs. In private homes, the act of lighting a candle often accompanied prayer, particularly during illness, childbirth, or death. Some households kept a single beeswax candle hidden away for sacred use, only brought out for blessings or the last rites. And when a person died, a candle was placed beside them. Its flame marked the journey from life to death. In a world where darkness was the norm, light was the realm of the sacred. The shape of fear in the dark. Without light, the night was alive with fears, some real, some imagined. Bandits, wolves, fire, illness, spirits, sin. These weren't just stories, they were lived experiences. A castle servant walking between buildings after dusk might clutch their candle like armor. Shadows became suspect. Unexplained sounds, a creak, a footstep carried weight in the dark. Children were warned not to venture outside after nightfall, not simply for moral reasons but because of actual danger. Wells, pits, and walls could be lethal when unseen. Candlelight was your only compass. And fear bred stories. The darkness became the realm of the supernatural. Spirits, fairies, demons, and ghostly knights were said to roam when no light could reach them. In castles, certain staircases or cellars were avoided at night, not because they were definitively haunted, but because, in the dark, anything unexplained could be terrifying. The flame didn't just banish darkness, it tamed the mind. The physical toll of the flame. Candles were not without consequence. Servants exposed to hours of tallow smoke experienced irritated eyes, persistent coughs, headaches, greasy residue on skin, clothing, and hair. The soot settled on walls and ceilings, creating the darkened interiors we often associate with medieval buildings. Candles also posed a constant fire risk. A dropped taper could ignite straw bedding, curtains, or woolen garments. Thus, rules developed. No candles near rushes. No open flame in storerooms. No candles left unattended. Accidents still happened. Some castle fires began in servant quarters, overcrowded, poorly lit, poorly ventilated. A single rushlight tipped from its holder could cost lives. Even in the act of creating light, people remained vulnerable. A dim world, not a bleak one. Despite all of this, the world after sunset was not necessarily bleak. Even limited light offered intimacy. The flicker of candlelight softened expressions. It brought people physically closer around the hearth, at the table, in shared tasks. Evenings were often times of storytelling, shared songs, quiet mending work, and whispered conversations. The darkness slowed the world. It narrowed attention. It created a kind of quiet connection impossible in the bustling hours of daylight. A servant mending a cloak beside the fire. A mother humming to a child while trimming a wick. A guard standing still on the battlements, watching the faint light of a faraway village. These were moments of stillness, and they mattered. The flickering boundary. In a world lit by flame, light was always in flux. It danced, it died, it came back again. People learned to live by that rhythm. They understood that no light was permanent, that fire could falter, that darkness was not the enemy but the ever-present companion. The castle itself reflected this. Bright at feast, dim at rest, glowing faintly in the night from a few guarded chambers. And so, one wonders, in a world where light was so fragile, did that fragility change how people saw truth, safety, and even love? In the last section, we left with a question. In a world where light was so fragile, did that fragility change how people saw truth, safety, and even love? To live in medieval times was to live in a world where light had weighed, a world where illumination was deliberate, costly, and always finite. This final section considers the legacy of medieval lighting, how the need for flame shaped culture, rituals, architecture, and memory, and how the dim glow of candles continues to flicker in our modern imagination. Because light, for all its flickering and faltering, endures. Built for firelight, castles were not designed with bright light in mind. Windows were small, narrow, and often unglazed in earlier periods, more for defense than illumination. Corridors were long and angled, with few natural light sources. Great halls relied heavily on daylight, but after sunset, even the most lavish chandeliers could not light the space fully. Ceilings were darkened by centuries of soot. The layout of the medieval castle was adapted for partial visibility. Furniture was arranged to maximize proximity to fires. Wall hangings helped absorb smoke and reflect heat. Strategic placement of torches and sconces revealed only what needed to be seen. As a result, shadows dominated. Corners receded into darkness. Objects took on different forms in dim light. Movement was noticed more than detail. Eyes trained themselves to interpret the flicker of firelight. This physical experience of darkness, so different from our own, shaped how people moved, perceived, and imagined. Language shaped by light. Even medieval language bore the mark of candlelight. To bring something to light was not just a metaphor, it was a lived reality. Words like enlightenment, illumination, and enlight drew from the physical act of seeing in the dark. A light in the darkness was a powerful religious and emotional symbol. In manuscripts, the decorative illustrations were called illuminations, not because they glowed, but because they metaphorically lit up the text. Light was associated with knowledge, clarity, and divinity. Darkness, by contrast, was not only absence but often represented ignorance, mystery, or evil. These ideas didn't arise from theory, they were born from daily experience. Flame in ritual and memory. Light permeated every important moment of life. Birth, midwives used candles during nighttime deliveries. Marriage, candles were carried in processionals and placed near the bedchamber. Death, candles stood watch beside the dying and were lit at funerals. Worship, the lighting of candles marked prayers, vigils, fasts, and feast days. Even the liturgy was structured around the dance between light and dark. In monasteries, night vigils were performed in near total darkness, with only a few candles burning. As dawn approached, more light was added, symbolizing the resurrection, the return of clarity, and the promise of redemption. Thus, lighting a candle was never a neutral act. It was intentional, full of meaning. Guilds, professions, and regulation. As cities grew, the control and production of light became professionalized. Chandlers' candle makers formed powerful guilds in many medieval towns. These guilds regulated quality of materials, candle size and weight, pricing structures, work conditions. There were also wax chandlers who worked exclusively with beeswax, and tallow chandlers who dealt in cheaper fat-based candles. The distinction mattered not just economically, but socially. Chandlers often operated out of separate shops due to the smell of rendering fat. Their homes were sometimes identified by the distinct aroma that lingered. And because candles were so essential to religious and civic functions, chandlers could hold surprising influence in their communities. In castles, resident chandlers were rare, but visiting tradesmen were common, especially before winter. Their arrival marked a seasonal preparation, time to stock the wax, pour the molds, dip the wicks. Candles were tools, but they were also inventory. The economy of light. By the 14th and 15th centuries, many households began to ration candles the same way they rationed food or ale. An estate might issue 1 tallow candle per evening to a lower servant, 2 beeswax candles per night to a noble, extra candles on feast days or during illness. A noble's steward tracked candle usage, reported shortages, and ordered resupply. In monastic accounts, candlely candles appear as line items, proof of their financial importance. In some towns, street lighting was required on certain festival nights, with fines for those who failed to place candles in their windows. Even lantern bearers were hired by wealthier townspeople to guide them at night. Light had value, a calculable, negotiated, and enforced one. In the dark, the mind expanded. Ironically, living in a dim world may have expanded the imagination. With so little visibility, much of life happened in the mind's eye. Stories were told aloud, not read. Rooms flickered, shifting with shadows. Faces were half lit, half suggested. Landscapes beyond the reach of a torch remained unknown. This ambiguity, this ever-present mystery, gave rise to myth, fear, and wonder. The darkness became fertile ground for superstition, legend, spiritual meditation, poetic thought. A peasant walking alone with a rushlight might imagine spirits in the trees. A monk praying by a taper might feel himself closer to divine revelation. A noble watching the last flame die might reflect on mortality. Light wasn't just functional, it was transformative. The end of the candles. The story of medieval lighting doesn't end with a dramatic shift, but with gradual change. Glass windows began to appear in noble homes, allowing better daylight. Lanterns improved, with horn or mica panes. The late 16th and 17th centuries saw increased oil lamp use. Eventually, gas lighting, then electricity, rendered candles decorative. But the cultural memory of candlelight remained strong. Even today, we still light candles for birthdays, prayers, remembrance, romance, mourning. We still equate flickering light with intimacy, solemnity, or peace. The medieval relationship with flame, its labor, symbolism, and fragility still lingers in these small acts. The last flame. So imagine it now. The castle is quiet, the fires are low. A servant walks the corridor with a lantern in hand. She pauses at a window, sees her own reflection in the faint glass, and continues on. Downstairs, a candle flickers near the chapel altar. In the gatehouse, the last rushlight burns out. Darkness returns, but it is not empty. It carries the weight of centuries of hands that dipped wicks, of eyes strained in its glow, of prayers whispered in its flicker. The candle has gone out, but its memory remains. Story 5. The kitchen never sleeps, feeding a castle through winter. Step out of the stone corridor and into the castle kitchen. It is winter, and the wind outside howls through the battlements. But here, in this low, vaulted room, heat clings to the stone like a second skin. The smell is unmistakable: smoke, stew, wet wool, and damp wood, but behind it all is the persistent rhythm of survival. While the rest of the castle quiets at dusk and freezes through the night, the kitchen remains awake. Not bustling, not loud, but always active. This is where we begin, with the cooks, scullions, and fire tenders who kept the castle fed not just during feasts, but through long, dark winters when fresh food disappeared, firewood dwindled, and hunger threatened the entire household. This is the story of how medieval kitchens sustained life when the world outside turned to ice. The layout of a medieval kitchen. In large castles, the kitchen was a separate structure or a wing off the Great Hall. This was partly to prevent fire hazards. Kitchen blazes were common, and partly to control smoke. Some smaller keeps housed the kitchen in a lower level, but most substantial castles built it apart. The room was more functional than decorative. Stone hearths, sometimes as wide as a wagon, dominated one wall. Open fire pits allowed for large cauldrons to be suspended from iron tripods or hooks. Ovens were often dome-shaped, built into the walls and fired with wood. Prep tables, rough and thick, sat under narrow windows that offered poor lighting in winter. Hooks and chains hung from beams above, holding pots, pans, and sometimes game carcasses waiting to be butchered. Flooring was typically stone, and in winter it remained slick from melted snow carried in on boots or from spilled broth. Rushes or straw were scattered to absorb liquids, but they also fed rats. The kitchen was not cozy, but it was warm, and that warmth made it one of the most important and most populated spaces in winter. The staff who worked the kitchen. In winter, the kitchen crew grew leaner. Travel ceased, visitors dwindled, and the household shrank to its core members. But still, mouths needed feeding every day. A typical kitchen team included the head cook, often male, experienced, and sometimes promoted from servant ranks. He supervised menus, ordering, and scheduling. Undercooks managed roasting, boiling, and baking stations. Scullions, young boys or low-ranking servants responsible for cleaning pots, fetching water, and grinding grain. Butler or pantler oversaw the storage of wine, ale, and bread. Larderer managed meat supplies, especially salted cuts and smoked goods. Spicer in wealthier castles maintained valuable spice stores under lock and key. Women were present, often in roles tied to dairy, herb preparation, or brewing, though in larger kitchens, they might be excluded from the main cooking areas. In winter, the hierarchy was strict. Supplies were limited. Mistakes, burned bread, spilled flour, undercooked meat weren't just embarrassing. They were wasteful, potentially disastrous. What was cooked in winter? Winter menus in a castle were restrictive, but far from barren. Fresh produce was rare, but preservation, planning, and portioning kept food on the table. Staples included bread baked regularly using grain stored from autumn, coarse, dark, and dense. Salted meats, pork and beef salted in barrels. Ham, bacon, and preserved sausage were common. Pottage, a thick stew made of grains, peas, onions, garlic, and occasionally dried herbs or root vegetables. Beans and pulses, dried in autumn, soaked overnight. Dried or smoked fish, especially herring, stockfish, or eel, vital on meatless days. Cheese, aged hard cheese, often made from autumn milk and stored for winter. Ale and small beer, brewed earlier and consumed daily. Even children drank weak beer. Luxury items like imported wine, spices, sugar, or dried fruits might appear in noble meals, especially for feast days. But day-to-day fare was simple, warming, and repetitive. The goal wasn't variety, it was sustenance. The winter routine. The castle kitchen followed a precise rhythm, especially in winter when daylight was short and conditions were harsh. Pre-dawn, the fire tender rose to restoke embers from the previous night. Water was hauled often through snow from the well or river. Bread ovens were fired. Early morning, pottage was started. If meat was available, it was soaked or rinsed to remove excess salt. Midday, the main meal of the day, served in the great hall or chamber. Bread, ale, and a warm stew or roasted meat. Simpler fare for servants, finer cuts for lords. Afternoon, utensils scrubbed, floors swept, ash removed. Brewing and drying done indoors near the residual heat of ovens. Evening, a smaller, colder meal, leftovers, bread, cheese, maybe warmed broth. Throughout the day, kitchen staff rotated duties, maintained fires, and prepared supplies for the next day. In winter, nothing was wasted, even bones were boiled for stock. Storage and preservation. Feeding a castle in winter wasn't just about cooking. It was about what had been preserved in the months before. Meat was salted, smoked, or dried. Salt was expensive, so it was used strategically. Grain was kept in granaries or sealed barrels, safe from rodents and damp. Vegetables were stored in root cellars, turnips, leeks, onions, parsnips buried in straw or packed in sand. Herbs were dried in autumn and stored in linen sacks. Cheese and butter were wrapped in waxed cloth or buried in cold pits. Barrels lined the walls of storage rooms filled with ale, salted fish, and occasionally pickled cabbage or fruit preserves. But even with preparation by late winter, supplies ran thin. Rationing became stricter, portions grew smaller, and cooks grew inventive, stretching pottage, thinning stew, flavoring with garlic or mustard to mask the age of meat. Warmth as a byproduct. The kitchen's warmth was not a luxury, it was a byproduct of necessity. Fires burned for cooking, not for comfort, but still the kitchen became the place where servants lingered longer than needed. Children crept in with excuses to help. Dogs slept close to the hearth. A scullion might warm stiff hands over a pot. A cook might allow a sickly stable boy to rest near the oven wall. It was an unspoken rule. The kitchen was where warmth, literal and human, was found in winter. It wasn't generous, it wasn't sentimental, it was practical, but it mattered. The feast days in the cold. Amid the cold and repetition, the kitchen came alive for feast days: Yule, Epiphany, Candlemas. These were brief moments when dried fruits appeared, eggs were broken into dough, spices were fetched from locked chests, and ovens worked overtime. On such days, the kitchen was crowded and dangerous. Fires raged. Knives flew. Servants shouted. Pies were stuffed with preserved fruits and meats. Dough was kneaded with numb fingers. It was chaos, it was stress. But it was also a rare chance to transform winter food into ritual, to make something beautiful out of survival. After the feast, leftovers were repurposed, bones boiled, bread ends dried for trenchers. Nothing wasted. And the kitchen returned to its steady, silent rhythm. The winter kitchen never slept. Even in the dead of night, something in the kitchen remained awake. A pot on the hearth. An ember under ash. A boy curled beside the oven. A log shifting, flaring briefly. A rat scurrying near the pantry door. And in the morning, before the castle stirred, the kitchen would already be working again. The same tools, the same hands, the same fire reborn. The kitchen never slept because hunger never did. It was the warmest room in the castle, but not because it was comfortable. Because it had to be. But one might ask, when food grew scarce and firewood ran low, how did the castle kitchen stretch its supplies and its labor to last until spring? By midwinter, the barrels of salted meat have grown lighter, the root cellar smells of rot, and the grains must be sifted carefully for weevils. The castle is still standing, but the food stores are no longer plentiful. And the kitchen, it keeps working quietly, creatively. In this section, we explore what happens when the supplies begin to run thin, when the cook must become a strategist, the scullion a negotiator, and every crumb becomes precious. Here, in the depths of winter, food preparation becomes not just labor, but artful survival. The reality of scarcity. No matter how well prepared a household was in autumn, winter could stretch longer than planned. Ice thickened on castle walls. Trade routes froze. Fields remained buried under snow. Hunting became dangerous and yielded little. And so, the kitchen had to adapt. Even large castles were vulnerable. Wealth could not summon spring. And when the stores ran low, everyone felt it, though never equally. Nobles ate fewer courses, but still better than most. Household staff received thinner stews, smaller bread portions. Servants and laborers might eat only twice a day, if that. Animals unless needed were culled or allowed to go hungry. Hunger was never far from the castle door. The cook as strategist. In these lean months, the cook became a figure of quiet power. He or she knew the remaining stock better than anyone. Not just what was stored, but how much remained, how quickly it was spoiling, and what could be stretched. A single salted ham might feed the household over 5 days, sliced thin, boiled into broth, added to pottage, and eventually reduced to bone for soup. A moldy wheel of cheese could be scraped, cut, and mixed with mustard or herbs to mask its age. Dried herbs, saved from autumn, could refresh bland or bitter foods, tricking the tongue into thinking a dish was more nourishing than it was. The cook made decisions quietly: what to serve, what to withhold, when to ration further. And their role was not merely culinary, it was political. If the lord went hungry, it reflected poorly on the household. If the servants rebelled from starvation, it endangered discipline. The kitchen walked a narrow line between practicality and perception. Food hierarchy: who ate what and when. Medieval food distribution followed a strict, unspoken order. The lord and lady ate first with the finest cuts, best bread, and richest dishes. High-ranking household members, chamberlains, stewards, and favored retainers followed. Standard household staff received smaller portions of similar food or simplified versions. Low-ranking servants and workers ate last, often from communal pots and with the least variety. The same pottage might be thickened with barley for nobles and thinned with water for servants. Leftovers were often reused, not wasted. Bread crusts became thickeners. Bones were boiled twice. Vegetable peels might feed pigs or be turned into stock. But make no mistake, hunger was tiered. Stretching the meal. The culinary tools for surviving winter were few but effective. Breadcrumbs, used to bulk out stews, sauces, and even drinks. A day-old loaf could stretch a pot of broth. Ale-based soups, made with old beer, onions, herbs, and bread, filling even if bland. Turnips, onions, and garlic, the last survivors of the root cellar, often boiled until soft, sometimes roasted if fuel allowed. Egg substitutes, rarely available in winter unless hens were kept warm. But if eggs were scarce, cooks used cheese rinds or thickened milk to imitate their richness. Blood from recently butchered animals mixed into puddings, sausages, or thickened into gravy, a valuable protein source when meat was limited. Dishes were designed to fill the stomach, not please the tongue. When supplies truly ran out. Despite best efforts, some years were worse than others. A poor harvest the year before, an early snow, a siege, a pestilence that cut off trade. When the cellars emptied and the flour sacks held only dust, cooks turned to desperation dishes. Acorn meal, ground, soaked to remove bitterness and baked into dense cakes. Boiled bark, certain inner barks were edible and could be used in emergency porridge. Stale ale porridge, watered down, thickened with whatever was available, and salted lightly. Rat or crow, not common, but during sieges, anything that moved could become food. Pigeon eggs or chicks, if kept in dovecotes, these were valuable winter proteins. The taste was poor, the nourishment minimal, but these meals sustained life just barely. Fuel, the forgotten resource. No meal could be made without fire. And in winter, firewood was nearly as precious as flour. Kitchen fires required. Dry wood, green wood smoked and ruined food. Quick-burning kindling, for the bread ovens. Slow-burning logs, for all-day stews and boiling. If wood ran low, fires were reduced to morning and evening only. Cooking times were cut short. Bread was baked in communal batches. Servants shared meals to conserve fuel. Ash was saved, sometimes used in cleaning, and even in the lye-based soaking of grain to soften it faster with less heat. Spoilage and rot. As weeks passed, the risks increased. Meat went sour in its brine if the salt had been insufficient. Root vegetables molded if the cellar was too damp. Ale soured into vinegar, which could be used sparingly but was no longer drinkable. Grain became infested with insects. Cooks learned to inspect food with eyes, nose, and touch. Slightly turned meat could be boiled longer. Tainted grain was sifted. Bread that went hard became porridge or was fed to animals if any remained. Food never improved in winter. It only declined. The challenge was to manage that decline slowly and carefully, buying enough time to reach spring. The psychological toll. Cooking during scarcity was not just laborious, it was stressful. Cooks feared making mistakes that cost valuable supplies. Servants dreaded discovering rot in the grain bins. Scullions worked longer hours, scrubbing with icy water, hauling heavy pots, enduring burns and scalds. Complaints from the lord or lady could mean punishment or dismissal. There was no prestige in feeding a castle during a hungry winter. Only the quiet knowledge that everyone depended on your hands. Evening meals in lean times. In wealthier seasons, the evening meal might feature pastries, roasted meats, or fresh fruit. But by February, the evening meal was often a bowl of thinned pottage, a heel of bread, a small wedge of cheese, if any remained, ale sometimes sour. Silence at the evening table was common, not from reverence but from resignation. As the candle burned low and the hearth's heat dimmed, even the warmest room in the castle could feel cold with uncertainty. And yet the kitchen endured. Because hunger, though constant, was not new, and those who cooked through it knew how to wait, how to stretch, how to survive. But what happens when spring finally arrives? When snow melts but stores are gone, and the first harvest is still weeks away. Spring has come, but there is no food. The snow is melting in the courtyard. The birds have returned to the trees. The muddy road outside the gate is once again passable. But inside the castle, the cellars are empty, the larders nearly bare, and the cooks are watching the skis, praying for a break in the weather, not just for warmth, but for growth. Because this time between the end of winter and the first edible shoots of spring is often the hungriest of the year. This final section tells the story of that overlooked moment, the starvation season, as it was sometimes called, the weeks where a castle had survived the worst of the cold, only to find itself weakened by hope too early and food too late. The starvation season. Today, we celebrate spring as a time of abundance, but in the medieval world, the early weeks of spring were fraught with uncertainty. This period, roughly February through April, was called the Hunger Gap in agrarian documents, the lean quarter in some monastic records, or simply the season of hope and hunger. Why? Because by now, salted meats had been consumed or spoiled. Dried legumes were running out. Root vegetables were sprouting in storage or turning to mush. Ale barrels were dry or spoiled. Firewood supplies had been used or were too wet from melting snow. And fresh food from the fields was still weeks away. It was not the coldest time, but it could be the deadliest, especially for the poor, but even for castle households unprepared for a long winter. The last of the stores. In these weeks, the kitchen became a place of salvage and invention. What remained? Fat skimmed from broth pots weeks before, scraped from jars. Old grains, some slightly infested, winnowed and soaked. Bones saved from earlier meals, now boiled again for stock. Bread crusts, dry and curling, soaked in ale or broth. Mice or birds, if the traps were successful. Sprouting onions, their centers still edible, cut and boiled. No ingredient was too small, nothing was wasted. Bread might be made from flour mixed with ground peas, acorns, or even sawdust, not out of tradition, but desperation. A single egg from a brave hen was cause for quiet celebration. Monastic wisdom and communal meals. Interestingly, Monastic communities often fared better during these weeks not because they had more food, but because they had structure. Monks documented their supplies carefully. Rations were consistent. Meals were simple year-round, so the transition to scarcity was less jarring. Some even cultivated indoor herbs or used cloister walls to grow early greens. In towns and castles, communal cooking sometimes helped. A single large pottage pot could feed many servants with less fuel. Leftover food from noble tables, if any, was distributed carefully, sometimes supplemented with donated ale or milk from neighboring farms. Charitable customs, especially around Easter, occasionally helped ease hunger, but rarely made it disappear. The waiting game. With nothing new to cook, the kitchen became a place of anticipation. Cooks and gardeners looked for the first green shoots. Nettles, sorrel, dandelion leaves, wild garlic, chickweed. These herbs, bitter but edible, were gathered from castle walls, hedges, or forest edges. Washed and boiled into broth, they provided essential nutrients and hope. Meanwhile, garden plots were turned over, tools sharpened, seeds inventoried. But the soil was often too wet or too frozen to plant. The kitchen staff found themselves waiting, watching each day for a sign that spring had truly begun. Reviving the fire. After a long winter, the hearth was scarred and blackened. The bread oven, perhaps unused for weeks, had cooled and dried. Clay might have cracked. Chimneys were clogged with soot. Before spring cooking resumed in earnest, the kitchen itself needed resuscitation. Ovens were repaired with fresh mortar. Ashes were removed and stored for soap making or dyeing. Broken utensils were mended by the blacksmith. New barrels were ordered for the season ahead. Fire had carried the castle through winter. Now it needed renewing, just like the fields. The first feast of spring. Despite the hardship, the arrival of spring often brought a ritual meal. Not lavish, far from it, but symbolic. When the first green vegetables appeared, they were sometimes prepared with salt, vinegar, or a touch of mustard, and served to the lord and household as a ceremonial end to winter fare. Lamb or kid, if available, was the traditional meat of spring. Fresh cheese marked the beginning of the milking season. Eggs became more common as hens resumed laying. Herb pottage was served to cleanse the body and reawaken the senses. This meal, more than any winter banquet, felt like a true celebration not of wealth, but of endurance. The kitchen in these moments was no longer merely practical, it was triumphant. Lessons from the lean season. The starvation season taught a lesson that lingered all year. Prepare, conserve, respect the stores. Cooks remembered which foods lasted and which did not. Stewards adjusted their autumn orders. Lords reconsidered the generosity of their feasting. The memory of those lean weeks hung over spring and summer. Every grain harvested was treated with care, every dried bean counted. And when winter returned, as it always did, the kitchen braced itself once more with slightly more knowledge, slightly better tools, and the bitter reminder that spring does not guarantee survival. A final image, the kitchen in spring. Now picture it. A servant kneels beside the oven, checking the mortar for cracks. A scullion pours the last of the old barley into a sack. The cook, sleeves rolled, is peeling the season's first wild garlic, her fingers green and stained with sap. Outside, the sun cuts low through bare branches. It is warmer, but not warm. Inside, the kitchen breathes again, not quite busy, but stirring. A space that never truly stopped, never slept, and never gave up, no matter how empty the larder. The fire is rebuilt. The pots are scrubbed. And tomorrow, something green will go into the stew. In the end, the castle kitchen was not the heart of joy or luxury or beauty. It was the heart of persistence, of managing with what remained, holding the line until the land could feed them again. Story 6. Sleeping cold nighttime survival in the medieval bedroom. When you lie in bed tonight, wrapped in layers, perhaps with a warm drink or a heated blanket, consider this. For much of human history, sleep meant enduring cold. Not the chill of poor insulation or a drafty window, but the deep, unrelenting cold of stone walls, no central heating, and nights that stretched long into darkness. This story is about how people, especially those living in castles and manor houses, survived sleep during medieval winters. It wasn't romantic, it wasn't comfortable, and it certainly wasn't restful by modern standards. But it was necessary. And so, with that in mind, let us open the heavy wooden door, duck beneath the low lintel, and step inside the medieval bedroom, not a room of luxury, but a battleground against the cold. The Stone Cave. The walls were made of stone, thick, cold, and wet with condensation. In castles, especially older keeps, insulation was practically non-existent. The very thing that protected you from invaders also sapped your body heat. Stone holds cold. The larger the room, the worse the problem. A noble might sleep in a spacious chamber that echoed with every step. These rooms had tall ceilings, open beams, and often single glass or no glass windows shuttered with wood. In winter, the windows were shut tight, but wind still crept through. Humidity was trapped inside, and moisture, combined with breath and sweat, created an environment that never quite dried. The smell was of damp wood, old wool, stale air, and faint smoke from a distant hearth that never reached the corners. This was the environment where medieval people attempted to rest and recover every night for months. The bed, a fortress of fabric. If there was one piece of furniture that mattered most in winter, it was the bed. Beds were not just for sleeping, they were survival equipment. For the wealthy, beds were often made of heavy oak or walnut, raised off the ground. Why? Because stone floors radiated cold, and even the lowest servants knew that sleeping too close to the floor meant waking stiff and shivering, or worse. A proper bed might include a straw-filled mattress, sometimes with horsehair or rags added for firmness. A feather bed placed atop the mattress, especially for the wealthy. Several wool blankets, coarse but warm. A linen sheet, changed sparingly due to the labor of washing. A bed curtain, often thick wool or tapestry, hung from a canopy or hooks around the frame to trap heat. Furs, especially deerskin, wolf, or fox, laid over the sleeper or beneath the covers. The bed, once prepared, was more like a cocoon than a sleeping surface. Multiple people often shared the bed not out of intimacy, but necessity. Body heat mattered more than privacy. Who slept where? While the lord and lady might have a room with a hearth, and perhaps even a private chamber, most people in the castle lived and slept in shared spaces. Servants often slept in the great hall or in lofts above stables. Children bunked with one another in closets or annexes. Kitchen staff might sleep near the ovens, benefiting from residual warmth. Guards sometimes rotated shifts to stay warm, sleeping in pairs with blankets. In these situations, sleep was more about getting through the night than true rest. And yes, bed sharing was entirely normal. It might be a brother and sister, two kitchen boys, or a maid and her mistress. Social rules flexed in winter. Warmth took priority. Heating the room, a futile dream. Let's dispel a modern fantasy. Most bedrooms were not heated. Fires were expensive. Wood had to be gathered, split, dried, and conserved. A hearth in the bedroom, if one existed, was small and inefficient. It might be used in the early evening, but rarely burned all night. In fact, many feared sleeping with a live fire. Smoke inhalation, chimney fires, and even sparks catching the bedding were serious risks. Instead, medieval people relied on body heat, layers of bedding, curtains, hot stones or coals, One common technique was to heat a stone or brick by the fire, then wrap it in cloth and place it beneath the bedding. These acted like primitive hot water bottles. Another was a bed warmer, a long-handled pan filled with embers and passed between the sheets to warm them just before sleep. But these were stopgaps. Within minutes of lying down, the bed grew cold again. What to wear to bed? There was no such thing as pajamas, but people did not sleep naked. The usual sleeping attire: linen undershirts or chemises, woolen stockings or hose, nightcaps to protect ears and scalp, mittens in colder regions, occasionally a woolen hood or cloak pulled over the shoulders. These were not just for comfort, they were necessary. Frostbite was a genuine concern. Toes, fingers, and ears could become numb. Waking in the night to check on livestock, attend to a crying child, or visit the privy meant braving bitter temperatures. Better to stay bundled. And for those without proper attire, shared warmth was the only option. Nighttime routines and rituals. The path to bed was rarely straightforward. Before sleeping, most castle residents relieved themselves in chamber pots or privies, often freezing cold. Said prayers, a vital part of nighttime routine. Removed or folded clothing, though often slept partially dressed. Checked the shutters, lest wind or snow sneak in. Banked the fire if one was present. Wrapped coals or stones, placed them in the bed. Listened for night sounds: howling wind, restless animals, distant footsteps. Then, wrapped in layers, they climbed into bed. Stillness wasn't immediate. Limbs took time to warm. Sleep came slowly, especially when breathing fogged the air and the stone walls radiated cold like grave markers. The cold of the night, interruptions and discomforts. Medieval sleep was often interrupted. It came in phases. The cold could wake a person several times a night. So could the need to urinate in the cold, coughing from damp air or smoke residue, loud winds rattling shutters, rats or mice moving through the walls or thatch, snoring or shifting from bedmates. Some nights a person might wake and simply sit in bed, whispering prayers, warming hands beneath the sheets, and waiting for the chill to pass. These intervals between sleep phases were sometimes used for quiet conversation, storytelling, or intimate moments if energy allowed. But more often, people simply waited for sleep to return. The privilege of warmth. In the depth of winter, warmth was not assumed. It was a privilege one earned through wealth, preparation, or status. A merchant's home might have a better hearth than a castle's guest room. A well-placed peasant cottage, small and low to the ground, might retain heat better than a grand but drafty tower chamber. But for most, sleep meant enduring the cold. And while the modern mind might imagine stone castles as majestic, to the medieval body, they were often freezing prisons at night. To survive them, people relied not on architecture, but on bedding, bodies, and habit. But if winter nights were long and harsh, what did people dream of, and how did dreams themselves reflect the cold, the dark, and the daily struggle to survive another dawn? Once curled beneath the layers of wool and fur, with only a candle stub flickering on the table and breath visible in the air, medieval sleepers did not simply pass out in exhausted slumber. Their nights unfolded in shifts, and so did their minds. This section explores what sleep looked like during the coldest months, not just physically, but mentally, spiritually, and socially. Because while the body lay still, the medieval mind traveled through dreams, fears, saints, demons, and practical plans for the next freezing day. Segmented sleep, first and second sleep. Contrary to modern assumptions, medieval sleep was often segmented. The concept of first sleep and second sleep is well documented. The first sleep would begin a few hours after sunset and last roughly until midnight. A waking period followed, usually lasting an hour or more. Then the second sleep would last until dawn. This pattern was natural in the absence of artificial light. In winter especially, nights were long up to 14-16 hours of darkness. Sleeping straight through was rare. What happened in the gap between the two sleeps? Quiet prayer, reflection on dreams, visits to the chamber pot, quiet talking with bedmates, feeding infants or checking livestock, sometimes intimacy between spouses. People didn't resist this wakefulness. It was expected, even cherished. The in-between time was often called a period of watchfulness, not in the anxious sense, but in the spiritual, contemplative one. The cold in dreams. Cold entered dreams the way wind slips under a door slowly, then all at once. People dreamed of fire always just out of reach, running but never warming up, sunlight that wouldn't quite rise, frozen fields, starving animals, or wet shoes. For those suffering hypothermia or illness, dreams could blur into hallucinations. Fevers common in damp, smoky environments brought visions of saints, demons, or endless winter. In monastic records, cold-induced dreams were sometimes interpreted as moral lessons. Freezing might represent spiritual doubt or the absence of divine warmth. In some folk tales, dreams of being cold were omens, a sign that someone nearby would die in the night. Of course, many dreams were simple and mundane. A table full of hot stew, a walk in spring fields, a pile of dry wood waiting to be burned. Desire-shaped dreams, and in the medieval bedroom, few desires were stronger than warmth. Night terrors and superstition. When darkness ruled the hours, fear filled the gaps. Cold nights magnified every sound. Rats beneath the floorboards, cracks in the ice outside, wind howling through an arrow slit. In the absence of understanding, superstition thrived. Medieval people feared nightmares as physical entities, known as night hags or incubi-succubi. Sleep paralysis, interpreted as a demon or spirit sitting on the chest. The wild hunt, a ghostly procession that flew across the skis in winter. Spirits of the unbaptized dead, believed to roam on cold nights. To protect against these, people slept with a knife under the pillow, hung iron scissors above the door, burned juniper or herbs near the hearth, recited paternosters, our fathers, or psalms before bed. Dreams were not always internal, they were visits from beyond. The role of religion in nighttime thought. The cold night was the perfect setting for contemplation and for fear of sin. Medieval Christian doctrine emphasized that the soul was most vulnerable during sleep. Unconfessed sins might result in death and damnation. Nightmares were sometimes seen as punishment for impure thoughts. Monks often prayed compline and vigils at night, deliberately breaking sleep. For laypeople, nighttime was often when the weight of conscience surfaced. The stillness, the chill, the vastness of the dark all reminded them of mortality. And so, prayers were whispered beneath heavy blankets. Many kept a rosary or cross near the bed. Some kissed a relic before closing their eyes. Every night could be a final one. Winter made that risk clearer than summer ever could. The practical mind in the night. Not all nighttime thoughts were spiritual or fearful. The in-between hours of wakefulness also served as a time to plan how to stretch food stores, recall which animals needed tending the next day, strategize firewood use, listen to the health of a coughing child or restless spouse, go over harvest calculations, sowing work, or upcoming feast days. With no clocks, people developed internal time sense. The direction of the wind, the sounds of kitchen maids rising, the feel of the cold growing deeper, then easing. They thought in practical rhythms, measuring time by chores, weather, and habit. The shared bed, the shared experience. Winter sleep was rarely solitary, and that shaped dreams too. Couples, siblings, even unrelated travelers often shared beds, especially in manors, inns, or castles with limited space. The shared experience led to shared storytelling before sleep, whispered confessions in the dark, arguments over stolen covers, the discomfort of elbows, knees, and loud snoring, but also the reassurance of human proximity. Cold was easier to bear when there were others near. The sounds of another's breathing were, in their way, comforting. Dreams were sometimes told aloud in the night, interpreted by those awake, remembered in the morning. It was collective sleep, shaped not just by weather but by people. A candle in the dark. In some wealthier households, a night candle was kept burning short, expensive, and well protected. Its glow marked time, most burned 1 hour. It also served as a guide to the chamber pot, a deterrent for rodents, a comfort for the fearful. In the total dark of winter, a single candle was a lifeline. And when it burned out, silence returned, shadows ruled, dreams came. But what happened when sleep didn't come at all? When the cold, the fear, or the ache of hunger kept you awake hour after hour in the night? And how did people cope with those endless wakeful hours, trapped in their freezing rooms? You've tucked yourself under layers of rough wool and linen. The fire burned low hours ago. Outside, the wind moans through the trees and down the chimney. Inside, the stone walls drip with cold and your breath fogs in front of your face. Your limbs ache from the day's labor, but your toes are still cold and sleep won't come. This final section explores what medieval people did when they could not sleep, whether from discomfort, cold, pain, or anxiety. For many, winter nights were not peaceful rest but slow, difficult hours of endurance. Here, in the heart of the medieval bedroom, we find not just dreams but coping, restlessness, and the quiet rituals of getting through the dark. Insomnia in the Middle Ages. Though not named the same way we do today, medieval sources clearly show that sleeplessness was familiar. Causes ranged from cold, hunger, illness, emotional distress, fear, noisy roommates, religious guilt, or anxiety. Unlike today, insomnia was rarely treated as a medical condition. It was viewed either as a passing imbalance, a sign of spiritual trouble, or the result of improper habits. Monks who couldn't sleep were told to rise and pray. Laypeople were advised to eat warming foods, say a paternoster, or wrap heated stones in cloth. But most often, people simply lay in the dark and endured. Passing the wakeful hours. When sleep refused to come, some turned to small, quiet activities that could be done in bed or near the hearth. Prayer was the default response. Reciting psalms, litanies, or personal confessions helped distract the mind. Worry beads or prayer ropes were handled in the dark, fingers moving from knot to knot. Mental storytelling, replaying familiar tales or composing one's own, was a soothing pastime. Some nobles or literate servants might read by fire or candlelight, though parchment books were rare and precious. Others simply listened to mice in the thatch, to the creaking of timbers, to the low breathing of someone nearby. In great halls or communal sleeping quarters, whispered conversations sometimes started between bedmates. These could be gossip, stories, or philosophical thoughts, all muttered under heavy covers, breath fogging the shared air. Midnight tasks and quiet chores. Sometimes wakefulness became usefulness. People rose from bed and checked animals in the barn or stable, stoked embers in the kitchen hearth to prepare for morning, emptied chamber pots or retrieved water, spun thread by hand if light allowed, tended the ill or soothed crying children. In some households, a designated night watchman moved through the corridors, especially in castles, keeping an eye out for fire, theft, or danger. He too might stop for a whispered word with someone awake. And though it was rare, Some documented cases show that healers or midwives were called upon in the dead of night, meaning some were always prepared to be summoned. The psychological toll of cold nights. Cold and darkness amplify emotion. For medieval people already dealing with death, famine, war, or spiritual doubt, the night was a space where those fears gathered. Many wrote or spoke about the sensation of being abandoned by God, the fear of dying alone in the night without last rites, the presence of devils in corners, restless ghosts, or temptation pressing upon them. Insomnia could feel like a spiritual trial. Even the devout believed the devil worked hardest during long winter nights, whispering blasphemies or stirring doubts. Some monks reported waking from dreams filled with terror, then struggling to fall asleep again. The cold didn't just numb the body, it could unsettle the soul. Herbal and folk remedies for sleeplessness. In wealthier households or among wise women and healers, herbal treatments were sometimes prepared to encourage rest. Valerian root, steeped and drunk warm. Chamomile, lavender, and rose petals sewn into pillows. Poppy syrup or opium-based mixtures, rare and used with caution. Honeyed ale, sometimes heated with a bit of butter or milk. Rue, believed to ward off evil spirits and calm the mind. Not all were effective. Some were placebo, others mildly sedative, and a few potentially dangerous. But in the quiet hours of an icy bedroom, even the act of sipping something warm could help the body settle, even if sleep did not come quickly. The unwelcome morning. Ironically, the most difficult part of a sleepless night was not the darkness, it was the return of day. Dawn didn't mean rest, it meant duties resumed. Fires had to be relit. Frozen boots were forced onto sore feet. Frost had to be scraped from surfaces. Meals had to be made, animals fed, chores begun. There was no sleeping in for the weary. Unlike today, where insomnia can be mitigated by naps or flexible schedules, the medieval sleeper had no such luxury. Everyone was expected to resume work, regardless of how badly the night had gone. For this reason, chronic sleeplessness was feared not as a diagnosis, but as a weakening of body and soul. The cold could be endured, but without sleep, even the strongest grew brittle. Survival through custom and acceptance. Despite the hardship, people adapted. They learned to nap lightly when moments allowed during the day, to layer wisely, warming beds with furs and warmed bricks, to share warmth without shame or hesitation, to accept sleep in fragments rather than long, unbroken rest. The architecture of castles never softened, the wind never stopped howling, the fire never reached the corners of the room. But people survived because they learned to sleep in pieces, in layers, in prayer, in community. They accepted wakefulness not as failure, but as part of the long, cold night. A last glimpse of the bedroom. Picture a winter dawn in the 1300s. The shutter creaks open, gray light seeps across the flagstones, breath still curls from the mouth. The coals in the hearth have gone out, blankets are pulled tighter before they must be cast off. And somewhere, in a shared bed with curtains drawn, two children are whispering about a dream of spring. They will rise soon, but for now they lie still, cold, tired, but together. And perhaps at last, the castle is quiet enough for a final hour of sleep. In the end, the medieval bedroom was not a retreat from the world, it was part of the battle. The fight against cold, fear, and exhaustion didn't end with the closing of the door. But even in the darkest winters, humans found ways to rest, to dream, and to rise again.